Urge you to leave the conference room but remain in the building. Please follow the instructions provided over the building's public address system. If an emergency requires an evacuation of the building, an alarm will sound. Everyone should leave the building in an orderly fashion. Follow the exit signs to the nearest stairwell and exit the building. Do not use the elevators. And after exiting the building, proceed to the corner of Constitution Avenue and 7th Street, that way. Report to the emergency assembly area, which is across the street on the sidewalk on the south side of Constitution Avenue in front of the National Gallery of Art. Remain in the area until instructed to return. If you notice any suspicious activity, please alert building security. Actions that interfere or attempt to interfere with the commencement or conduct of the event or the audience's ability to observe the event, including attempts to address the speakers while the event is in progress, are not permitted. Any persons engaging in such behavior will be asked to leave. Anyone who refuses to leave voluntarily will be escorted from the building. FTC commissioners and staff cannot accept documents during the event. Such documents will not become part of the official record of this or any other proceeding or be considered by the commission. This event will be photographed, webcast, and recorded. By participating, you're agreeing your image and anything that you say or submit may be posted indefinitely at ftc.gov, on regulations.gov, or on one of the Commission's publicly available social media sites. Question cards are available in the hallway on the information tables immediately outside the conference room. Staff will be available to collect your question cards and provide them to the moderators to pose to the panelists. Please pass your cards to the end of the aisle to be collected. All right, that's over. My final task is to introduce our opening speaker. Let me say that I think the organizers of this hearing made a great choice. The speaker is the chairman of the FTC, Joe Simons. Even setting that aside, he would be a great choice. Chairman Simons has been a consistent supporter of the continuation and indeed the expansion of the FTC's merger retrospective program, most of which takes place in the Bureau of Economics. Indeed, I can go back to my very first conversation I ever had with Joe, and that conversation was dominated by many of the topics that will be covered by the four panels today. So it's great to have a chairman that appreciates both the historical, ongoing, and central role of merger retrospectives and the FTC's important and long-standing commitment to self-evaluation, criticism, and learning. So with all that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, Joseph J. Simons, Chairman of the FTC.
Thank you, Bruce. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our hearing on merger retrospectives. I've been waiting a long time for this. One of the primary reasons for holding our hearings on competition and consumer protection in the 21st century is to see how we are doing in terms of merger enforcement. Are we doing it the right way? And if not, how do we fix it? Achieving this purpose could also have an important effect on refreshing the strong bipartisan consensus on merger enforcement that existed for the past 2 decades or more. My belief is that merger retrospectives can play a critical role in making sure that our merger enforcement approach is on the mark and done with a strong bipartisan consensus. In instances where merger retrospective studies are feasible, we can directly test whether a decision to seek relief was appropriate or not, and whether remedies were effective in those cases in which we did obtain relief. We can also use retrospectives to test the tools that antitrust agencies use in analyzing anti-competitive mergers, such as guppies and merger simulations. That our methods of analysis make sense in theory is, of course, very important. But if they don't enable us to make reliable predictions in practice, what good are they? We need to understand whether our tools reliably predict merger outcomes or whether they result in too many false positives or negatives. In addition, merger retrospective studies can be an important asset in persuading courts to block anti-competitive mergers. First, merger retrospectives can help validate prospective merger review tools. Testing the efficacy of these tools can demonstrate to the courts that these tools are effective on identifying anti-competitive mergers. Second, retrospective studies can provide an empirical basis for a merger challenge. For example, these studies can help to persuade a court that a merger is anti-competitive by showing that similar mergers in the past resulted in anti-competitive outcomes. I see merger retrospectives as critical to ensuring the success of our merger enforcement program. Consistent with our tradition of self-examination, the FTC has been at the forefront of conducting retrospective studies. FTC economists have authored or co-authored more than 25 studies that have estimated the effects of mergers on competition. Merger retrospective studies have previously demonstrated their value to the Commission's past enforcement efforts. In the 1990s, the government lost a large number of hospital merger cases in a row, and the agencies actually considered whether to give up their hospital merger enforcement program. The Commission did not. Instead, under the direction of then-Chairman Muris, the Bureau of Economics conducted empirical economic studies that demonstrated the anti-competitive effects of certain past hospital mergers. These retrospective studies were critical in subsequent hospital merger challenges. But despite prior successes, merger retrospective studies raise a number of methodological and feasibility questions. And there are questions about what an optimal merger enforcement retrospective program should look like. There is also a practical challenge in performing a large number of merger retrospective studies that may be needed to fully understand the effects of our merger enforcement program. Merger retrospective studies are time-consuming. They require significant resources and data, so we need to understand how to best allocate our available resources in this area. In particular, we should consider whether and how the Commission can work with outside researchers on retrospective studies. That will also be a way potentially to improve transparency. Today's hearing will address many of these issues. The hearing will feature 4 panels addressing distinct sets of these questions. The first panel will focus on what we've learned from existing merger retrospectives. This panel will address questions of what are the requirements of successful retrospective studies, which industries are good candidates for such studies, and what types of questions may be effectively answered with merger retrospective studies. The second panel will focus on the use of merger retrospectives in prospective merger analysis. This panel will discuss how we can use merger retrospective studies to test the efficacy of economic tools used to forecast merger outcomes. The panel will examine what has already been done to test our economic tools and also discuss potential approaches for further testing of these tools. In addition, the panel will discuss how merger retrospective studies could be both used for qualitative and quantitative analysis in studying merger effects. The third panel will address the question of how the findings from merger retrospectives should influence merger policy. It will also discuss how retrospective studies should influence the case law. And finally, the fourth panel will focus on what should the FTC's retrospective program be over the next decade. I hope we will have a very lively, thought-provoking, and informative discussion today, and in fact, I'm very confident with these panelists that we will. It is only through vigorous debate and exchange of ideas that we can help to build a consensus on our antitrust policy, and particularly our antitrust merger policy. My goal is to make it easier to achieve, my sense is that it's easier to achieve this goal if we have good quantitative evidence to rely on, and of course, the merger retrospective studies would be critical to that. Before I leave, I want to welcome all those attending the hearing from outside the FTC. I would also like to recognize the efforts of the staff of the FTC, notably the Bureau of Economics, the Office of Policy Planning, the Office of Public Affairs, and the Office of the Executive Director. My fellow FTC commissioners and I are very grateful to all of the people who have contributed to producing this impressive event, including and especially our speakers. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoy today's program. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce each of the speakers, and then they'll come up to give their opening remarks. Limor Daphne is the Bruce V. Rauner Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School and a member of the faculty on the Kennedy School of Government. Jeff Prince is a professor and the chairperson of Business Economics and Public Policy at the Kelley School of Business at the University of Indiana University. Christopher Taylor is a Deputy Assistant Director in the Antitrust I Division of the Bureau of Economics at the FTC. And John Quokka is the Neil F. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Economics at Northeastern University. Limor.
Let's see. Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me here today, and also all of my fellow colleagues at the Bureau of Economics and the Federal Trade Commission. So I was asked to kick things off by summarizing what we know. This is panel one. So what we have learned about the healthcare sector from merger retrospectives. So I'm going to kick off with the subject we know most about, which is hospital mergers. And up there you can see the leading comment there is a real understatement. Hospital mergers are well studied. In fact, I'd venture a guess that most in this room have probably been involved in a hospital merger. So they're certainly very well studied. I've only listed on there, and the font is a little small, so it's probably for the best, 2 of the most recent studies of which I'm aware, but there is a very, very long list of studies. And the evidence basically confirms that mergers of close rivals lead to price increases, okay? And the quality effects of these transactions where they've been studied are also generally negative. Now, most of these studies use differences in differences methodology, where they compare the price effects of merging rivals with the price with parties that did not merge. Sometimes they look at rivals. Sometimes these studies address issues of selection into merger, and we'll talk about that, no doubt, during our panel discussion. You might call these event studies or reduced form studies, right? Some recent studies engage in what's known as structural model estimation. And what they do is they use data from a given point in time, and then they build a model and estimate parameters that generate the state of the world as best as possible. And when you have that model and those parameters, you can then use them to simulate what ifs. What if there's a merger? What if there's a conduct remedy? So it's a very flexible approach, and some of these studies have concluded effectively that elements of insurance plan design really ought to be incorporated into merger review. Elements of the insurance market, which are not quantitatively involved in the standard workhorse of hospital merger review, probably belong in there. So we're gaining insights from these studies on the state-of-art methodologies that we ought to use. More recently, and yes, yours truly is involved, there's empirical evidence, I expect we'll discuss it during the course of the day, that combinations of hospitals across geographic markets, so not just within markets where the hospitals are competing head-to-head for the same patients, but combinations of hospitals across geographic markets are associated with significant price increases. Okay, and some limited evidence of cost reductions. So that covers hospital mergers. Everything else relative to hospital mergers we know a little bit less about, but you should think of it in a way on the hospital front as an embarrassment of riches, because we do know a reasonable amount from merger retrospectives in the healthcare sector. And I would say that the research there is growing. There's substantial findings on physician consolidation, both horizontal and vertical. In these cases, again, price is most commonly studied, although there is a recent study by some economists here from the FTC, including Tom Koch and Nate Wilson, who have found adverse quality effects associated with vertical integration of hospitals acquiring physician practices. So there's lots of evidence that that leads to higher spending and to higher prices of services, and now there's evidence that there don't appear to be quality improvements, if anything, on the contrary. There are some studies I've done myself, a merger retrospective in the dialysis analysis industry, and the evidence suggests is consistent with price increases. I would say it's a little bit less conclusive than the other studies. In terms of what we know about insurance markets, I'm pretty sure this hearing is joint with the Department of Justice, who does the insurance market. Is it? The insurance, nope, okay, but they do the insurance market reviews, and it's also a personal area of interest, but, and clearly a relevant piece of healthcare markets. There are 2 merger studies, retrospectives, of which I know, and they too find that when insurers gain concentration in local markets, that premiums for insurance go up. Okay, and those studies do, I think, a reasonable job. I am clearly biased of controlling for factors that might otherwise have led to price increases. And finally, there's a vast literature on pharmaceutical mergers, including something by a panelist who will be speaking later in the day. Most of those studies, there are exceptions, but most of them focus on how pharmaceutical mergers impact R&D investments and innovation, which is distinct. So that life science focus is distinct from what we're seeing in the healthcare services or insurance landscape, where the focus really has more been on price. In the pharmaceutical merger space, generic companies, generic combinations aside, a lot of the focus is on what happens to R&D, what happens to innovation. Okay, so kind of to summarize, I would say that the merger retrospectives to date, most of them have been horizontal, hence the lead to the slide. There are some vertical merger studies, in particular the hospitals acquiring the physicians, but in the wake of the new combinations we are seeing, we don't have much information from prior retrospectives on what we're likely to see, be it on the insurer PBM mergers, the health insurer PBM mergers. We don't have much prior on that. We don't even have a horizontal PBM merger retrospective, pharmacy benefit manager. So there's definitely room for additional merger retrospectives to inform our understanding of the transformation that is going to be taking place and is already taking place, particularly on the vertical side. Last, I'd also kind of be remiss if I didn't observe that the sorts of retrospectives that we see from agency economists tend to be different than the sorts of retrospectives that we see from academics like me. And I want to make that point because later in the day, I think we'll be discussing what ought to be some policies potentially to promote creation of merger retrospectives. And just to point out what will probably be obvious to many of us, but perhaps not to every observer, which is that the academics tend to want to study large samples and make generalizable conclusions. We seek to publish in our journals, and the reader wants to understand not what happened when A bought B, but what in general is happening in this industry and what are the characteristics of marketplaces in which combinations tend to lead to efficiencies that are passed through or are not, and are there offsetting premium or price increases. The academic is interested in the general conclusion. And of course we know that antitrust enforcers are focused on the very particulars of any one case, as a merger review should be. And therefore the agency economists, when they do merger retrospectives, they are likelier to take a case study approach and use all of those insights to inform their conclusions and will arrive at something that is just got a different lens than the academic studies. I do believe these things are complements. The academics also, and this is significant to know, would have great difficulty in publishing a case study because the general, many journals are not going to be interested in the academic pursuit of studying what happened when this hospital bought that, or even when this PBM bought that one. There may be massive industry interest in that, enforcer interest in that, and the academics, particularly with the reduced form, want a large sample. With the new structural models, because they are so institution-specific, you may often see, and you will hear from panelists who've written studies that dive deep into into a particular transaction, but the objective of many of those studies, the contribution, is methodological. So it's going to be very cutting edge, potentially more difficult for enforcers to apply. So there are some trade-offs there, and I will close my opening remarks now. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I also would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this. I think dialogue like we're having today is very valuable for, I think, both sides, academics and practitioners, and I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. So, like Lee Moore, I think I'd like to open my remarks by giving a general sense of what I understand to be the way retrospective mergers have been done to date. So, there's a range of methods that have been used thus far. As Lee Moore noted, difference and differences, or some variant of, seems to be the most common. There's many examples of this. So essentially, let's think about the merging parties. Let's find comparable parties and look at their changes over time and make comparisons. Differences that we find we'll attribute as being effects of the mergers. So the list is very long. I'll gratuitously list my own paper on this, but I'll get into more depth in a minute. Then matching estimators is another popular approach. So the idea being, let's look at the merging parties, let's find similar parties on observable dimensions, match them up, and then look at differences in their outcomes. And the key thing there is to make sure that when we think about, what would be driving factors as to why some firms merged and others did not, we want to make sure that those factors are not driving the outcomes that we're measuring. And so, for example, Marty Gaynor's paper and others would find factors like this. We might say there are political factors that might have been driving the differentials, not other factors that are related to the outcomes. Another popular approach amongst economists would be an instrumental variables approach. So let's see if we can find what we call exogenous variation that we would say could explain why we'd see merging behavior, but also then would not be an explanatory factor for the outcome that we're measuring, often price, and use that to kind of isolate the variation that we would think is good for trying to see what the causal effects are of the merger. So Lee Moore and many others have done instrumental variables approach. One example is in her 2009 paper using co-location as an instrument, right, for the likelihood of engaging in a merger. A couple more things worth mentioning is using a focus on rivals. So the idea being that we might think some of the unobservables that could be contaminating our estimates may not be existent in rivals, but they would actually also manifest some of the merger effects. Again, price is a good reference point. So if we see price changes, it also could filter through into the rivals, so we could focus on them. And then, as Lee Moore mentioned, structural models also have merit in this area. There's been a range of analyses to use that approach, essentially putting structure on the supply and the demand side, and then using that to assess what we predict to happen with a merger, a change in market power, market structure. And then, as Matt and others have done, we can then use those models to predict and then compare them to what we actually observed. So the focus for me in my remarks is actually going to be on the non-price side. So I've done a little bit of work in this area, and I think, as Lee Moore said, there's a lot to be done here. I think there's a lot of openings. So when you think about price versus non-price effects, in some ways, if you think about, what should the control group be, right? So if I say, here's the merging firms, who am I going to compare them to as a control so I can see the differences in the outcomes? With non-price effects, in some ways, there could be some advantages there if you believe that the variables you're looking at are not so easily observed and not so quickly changed by competing firms. Then you might say that, if you have similar firms facing similar conditions, sometimes firms in the same market, if it's a non-price outcome variable, then they might actually be reasonable controls for the group that you're looking at, because they're not contaminated by the fact that they might also be reacting to whatever non-price changes you're doing as a result of the merger. So Lee Moore touched on this a little bit, and when you think on the non-price side of things, what have we really found in terms of merger effects on non-price variables? And I think the typical way to think about this is quality, but it could encompass other things. Hospitals, as we've seen, there's been a lot of action in this space. We've seen a lot of evidence of price increases in hospital mergers. Depending on the source, there is some mixed evidence when it comes to quality. So when you think about inpatient quality index, patient safety indicators, the list goes on and on. You do have ample evidence of declining quality, but there is some mixture in terms of what's been found out there. On the airline side, which is where I've done some work in this space, you definitely see some substantial price increases as a result of the mergers. But then there's also some evidence out there on quality impacts. And let me kind of dive into some of the work that I've done. One of the quality metrics that I've really focused on is on-time performance. I think that's kind of an obvious choice in this space to focus on. I think outside of price, there's an argument to be made that that's the metric that consumers would typically focus on. So what we find is we did a merger retrospective. Daniel Simon and I did a merger retrospective. And this covered about 10 to 15 years of time over the airline industry, during which span there were 5 major mergers. And what we found is, in the short run, we did see a worsening in on-time performance. But then in the longer term, we saw that flip into a notable improvement in on-time performance. And while it's difficult to really parse that out, it is consistent with the idea of having some short-run coordination challenges, but then long-run efficiency improvements. And that manifesting in the data. And then there's certainly other measures of interest with airlines. You could think about things like routing quality, cancellations, lost baggage. I mean, we've all traveled. You can think of anything that's going to drive you crazy when it's not there. We can measure those kinds of things. So Chen and Gale actually have a paper looking at some of these. And they find some impacts on some, not so much on others. And I'll come back to that because I think that's an important thing to think about is what are the range of things we should be looking at, right? So another, I think, relevant point that focuses on some of the research I've done, this isn't with regard to a merger retrospective, but I think it highlights an important component when it comes to non-price outcomes. So in another paper, Daniel and I look at the effects of entry and entry threats on-time performance in the airline industry. And we actually find that on-time performance gets worse with entry and entry threats by low-cost carrier, and in particular Southwest, but we actually found this for several other low-cost carriers as well. And I think the relevance of this for the merger analysis is it speaks to, unlike with price competition, when you think about when we do merger analysis and say what's the impact on price, it's typically framed in the context of 2 competing forces. There's increased market power, which would push price up, and then there's increased efficiencies with it, which then could push prices down, and then it creates ambiguity as to what the net effect would be. With non-price outcomes, even if you just focus on the market power side of it, there's already ambiguity there. So if you look at the theoretical literature and even some of the empirical work out there, I think what we found with the airlines actually points this out in that there's not necessarily the cleanest of relationships between market power and non-price outcomes as much as there would be with what we understand to be going on with market power and price. So what are some challenges in this area when you think about quality measurement? Well, when you think about we've got a lot more data out there, a lot more things we can measure, the range of quality metrics that we can consider is certainly growing, right? We can get data on these things, we can start analyzing them. So you think about healthcare, certainly there's a wide range of outcomes that we could be looking at. When you think about, say, technology, like a smartphone, right? If I talk about quality competition on smartphones, the list goes on all the dimensions that I could be looking at. So one of the key issues that I think is worth at least thinking about is what are the subsets of non-price factors that we should be looking at? So when you think about multi-dimensional quality competition, the theory is even more complicated in that space. So this already creates challenges. And I think another concern that I have is, when you think about, we as academics, we try to think about big picture problems, and we pick variables we think are interesting to look at, do an analysis on these types of things. When you've got all that going on, but then there's many, many variables to choose from, I do worry about, even if we're not individually doing any data mining or things like that, collectively it becomes something like that, where if you're analyzing 50 different variables, you're bound to find something, even if it's not really a material impact that's going on. So thinking hard about, what's the selection mechanism for the variables that we're actually going to focus on? Is it simply ones that we can demonstrate meaningfully impact demand? Are there other ways to think about it, creating composite measures of quality rather than just looking at many dimensions simultaneously, I think is worth thinking about. So some main takeaways, right? The retrospective merger analysis for non-price outcomes, if you think collectively, there's some mixture in terms of what we find there. And I think it highlights the importance of careful, disciplined industry analysis when assessing merger impact, particularly for non-price outcomes. And in contrast to price, the lack of the clear tie between market power and non-price variables like quality contributes to the ambiguities of the findings up to date. So I think there's a lot of value in thinking hard about what to be analyzing and what are some of the important forces that might drive the response of those variables to mergers. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Good morning. Let me, not being an academic, let me give the standard disclaimer. The views expressed are my own and not necessarily those of the commission or the commissioners. So I'm going to take you through the literature on petroleum mergers. But I think it's more important than that, because not only am I going to talk about what we learned about the petroleum industry, but more importantly, I think what we learned about retrospectives in general. Up. Okay. So some background on the industry. There are multiple levels to petroleum industry. At the first level, we have bulk supply, so refining or large quantities of gasoline or diesel fuel. And then the second level of the industry, we have distribution, so local terminals, trucks, gas stations. So there are really three main types of merger retrospectives mergers we're looking at. We're looking at mergers among refiners or bulk suppliers, so horizontal mergers. Mergers at the distribution level, so retailing and such, and also horizontal, but then vertical mergers between bulk suppliers and retailers. And just to sort of go on top of that, there also can be mergers that are horizontal and vertical sort of at the same time, and these will come up in some of the retrospectives as well. So the FTC has been very active in doing merger retrospectives. We have 7 retrospectives currently looking at 9 different transactions. There's some examples there. I mean, to summarize the FTC studies thus far, we've not found consistent evidence of an increase in retail prices from these transactions. There was one case with some evidence of a retail price decrease due to an efficiency. There was another cases where prices were expected to decrease and did post-merger, but that was not related to the merger. There was a change in structure within the market. The studies have found much more mixed results at the wholesale level. This is one of the more interesting facets of this industry. There are multiple wholesale prices, and some of them are not observable by the researcher, which makes interpreting wholesale price effects that much more difficult. So, for example, if you're looking at average unbranded wholesale prices rather than low wholesale unbranded prices, you could end up with very different conclusions. But this is why the FTC staff have generally concentrated their attention on the retail level, and so this is one of the issues in any merger retrospective. If you've got multiple price measures, you have to be very careful about which prices you're actually looking at. But another activity of the FTC staff, we spent a lot of time replicating some findings in a 2004 GAO report, and I'll discuss those findings when we actually are discussing the GAO report. So the Government Accountability Office did 2 studies of the petroleum industry, 2 merger retrospectives. They were later partially published. And these were at the request of Congress. So both of the GAO studies looked at possible wholesale price effects of multiple transactions across the entire country. The effects were essentially a weighted average of all the wholesale prices at locations that GAO identified as being in a treatment group. The 2004 study looked at 8 mergers in the mid to late 1990s. They estimated 28 price effects across different wholesale prices and formulations and found 16 positive effects, 7 negative effects, and 5 prices that had no effect. This led to a number of interpretation issues since the merger could have had positive, or some of the mergers had positive and negative effects across different prices and formulations. So the reason I really want to get into this is the FTC technical report and replicating these estimates for some of the gasoline specifications found very different results. We found the results were very sensitive to the identification assumptions. They did not do a standard difference in difference approach, which was really not obvious until you got into the weeds, if you really understood the estimation identification assumption. And in another case, they had omitted significant data that also affected the results. So ultimately, after the replication exercise, we could only find one merger that had wholesale price effects. And this transaction was one that we were already in the process, so we already had studied in Taylor and Hoskin, and we found very different results at retail. So in 2009, also at the request of Congress, GAO did a second study. They found 2 wholesale price effects, positive and 1 negative, and 4 transactions that had no effect. But what was interesting, primarily to us and as a researcher, is that they used a different identification strategy from the previous study. They did a true difference in difference estimation. Once again, if you looked at their study sort of in a cursory way, it looked like the identification assumption was the same, but if you looked at it carefully, you could tell that they had actually changed it to a true difference in difference specification. One of those transactions where they found wholesale price effects, we studied and published in Sylvia and Taylor 2013 and found no retail price effects. So there were 2 other U.S. retrospectives in literature, Hastings and Gilbert. Both of those papers reviewed changes in vertical integration in California. Both of those found effects. We later studied both of those transactions, one as a replication exercise and one looking at retail prices. And in both cases, we could find no consistent retail price effect. So I wanted to briefly talk about non-U.S. petroleum merger retrospectives, if for no other reason, more in contrast to some of the U.S. studies. So there have been studies in Canada, Australia, Argentina, and in Europe. Few examples are on the slide. That's not an exhaustive list. Sen and Townley looked at retail in Canada. Hood looks at retail transaction in Quebec. Coloma did a study of Argentinian refinery merger. There have been multiple mergers in Europe that mainly looked at retail. So these non-U.S. studies, very similar to the U.S. studies, generally use a difference in difference framework. They more often than not find effects. In at least one case where they didn't find a transaction effect, the authors did a number of testing to suggest that there was pre-existing collusion in the market before the transaction. But I think one thing that's common to most of these U.S. studies that is different from the United States is the level of concentration and the amount of regulation in the industry. Concentration in these countries tend to be considerably higher than the United States, at least 1,000 points higher in terms of HHI. And a number of these countries have regulations that make coordination easier, such as post and hold regulations, and in some cases, retail entry restrictions. So what do I think we've learned? I think these are more lessons for merger retrospectives in general, as well as really for the petroleum industry. And this, I think, keys off something that Limor was already raising. I mean, the point of doing these studies is not totally about whether a particular transaction had an effect, but why that transaction may or may not have had an effect. So I think it's really important to have a clear design of the merger retrospective so that the study to learn larger lessons about broader outcomes. We can obviously challenge consummated mergers, but we're trying to learn about merger policy more generally. And this really comes down to a well-documented study. Why do the assets in the transaction potentially lead to an effect, or why they didn't? Another lesson, we need to examine meaningful price. I think in this case, retail prices. Showing one wholesale price change is not necessarily a sufficient condition to actually have an effect. In this industry, it's really about the geographic markets and where the marginal supply is coming from. And I think that's one of the main things we learned in this industry, but it certainly applies to other industries as well. And I could go into more detail, and we can during question time, but trying to do too many transactions in one study, I think, is a recipe for failure. But the last point I want to make really has to do with documentation and replication. I think we've all of us who've tried to replicate someone else's study understands the number of decisions that they make that may or may not be well documented. And, this is a challenge, and this is something that I think we all need to be better at. But the other point of replication is really to understand robustness and be able to decompose the effects. A number of our replication studies have started by being able to try and understand more carefully where the effects come from. So I think I'll stop there.
Good morning. Let me add my thanks as well to Dan Greenfield, Dan Hoskin, Bruce Kobayashi, and others who organized this, and certainly for the invitation to me to be here. I am an alumnus of the FTC, a proud alumnus, and always happy to be invited back. Let me also acknowledge something that I think Chairman Simons has mentioned already. The role of the FTC in merger retrospectives has historically and up to the present time been crucial. The very first recognizable merger retrospective was done here by two economists, David Barton and Roger Sherman, back in the 1980s. And looking back on it, while it seems in many ways crude, it certainly is indicative of the methodology and the importance of doing these studies. Of course, others have advocated doing retrospectives along the way. We have, I think, on the program today, Dennis Carlton, who has called for these studies for quite some time, as well as Bill Kovacic, particularly when he was here at the FTC. I view doing retrospectives as an act of good public policy. The courage of an agency to examine its own decision, and on occasion where appropriate to leave with some conclusions that may not be entirely favorable, is the sort of good public policy that I think we don't always, perhaps often, see. I don't have any PowerPoints. I did not get them prepared in time, but the good news is that a good deal of what I have to say has already been said by my fellow panelists, so if you remember some of their PowerPoints, that will suffice. Dan asked me to discuss some of my work, and I will, but let me begin somewhere else by setting out what I think are three different purposes of doing retrospectives. And these match up to some degree with the scope of the undertaking. So one route is to do a retrospective on a particular merger, a single merger, looking at a particular outcome from the event. So there are a fair number of these. For reasons that Limor mentioned, these may be more commonly done within the agency than by academia, but they are incredibly important because they provide insight for the agency into the appropriateness of the action that may have been taken as a policy measure for a particular merger. Which is to say that in some instances, the outcome may not have been what was predicted, or the choice of policy may not have turned out to be as intended. And it's an important part of continuous improvement in policy to look back on those and to determine what it is that perhaps should have been recognized at the time a decision was made to clear a merger or to challenge it or to apply a remedy or a particular type of remedy or not. Those actions, those insights really need to be developed on the basis of a stock of data that's only available within the agency. Joe Farrell and I wrote a short policy piece a couple of years ago where we said that one of the great unexploited areas of information for agencies was their own past case-bringing decisions, investigations, and choices of policy. We tend to look as economists for new theories, new empirical evidence, et cetera, but the reality is that the agencies sit on a vast store of information that has not, I think, adequately been tapped. So that's the role of looking at individual or single mergers. A somewhat different strategy is one that the FTC has pioneered successfully as well. And that is to identify a broader issue or an industry where there is a problem worth investigating. The hospital mergers that Lee Moore mentioned, and Chairman Simons as well, is an example of where, because the agency was unsuccessful in persuading the courts about a particular problem that the agency knew full well should have been addressed differently by the courts, the agency stepped back and used consummated mergers cleared by the courts as a basis for developing better techniques and certainly better policy to inform the courts. So a single industry or a single issue, in some instances, I think, can be addressed by launching a series of targeted retrospectives at that issue or at that industry. Healthcare and the hospital mergers are a good illustration of the industry case. An issue which I've promoted is to examine potential competition mergers. The courts have established a pretty high bar, but again, one of the ways of reviving the ability of the agencies to bring successful challenges to mergers that eliminate a potential competitor and raise competitive concerns is to develop a set of retrospectives on cleared or consummated mergers where a potential competitor has been eliminated. I've done one of these, and if I have time, which I doubt I will, I can talk a bit about that. But this is a topic area that I think would invite such investigation as well. Third use of retrospectives is to compile in some fashion all available retrospectives and to try to draw inferences from that body of literature about policy questions. And this is, in fact, where a good deal of my work in recent years has been devoted. There have been compilations of retrospectives done by Matt Weinberg, who's here, and by Orly Ashenfelter, I think, is in the program as well, and others. They've compiled available retrospectives and drawn some inferences. What I did was to launch, I think, a more comprehensive survey with the assistance of Dan Greenfield and another former student of mine at Northeastern who assisted in the compilation process and analysis process of the existing literature. And this found its way into a meta-analysis and a book and some articles that I've published. So in brief, a meta-analysis, as you know, has distinctive strengths for these purposes because the most obvious is numbers. Inferences and implications are not dependent on single cases or idiosyncratic experiences or cherry-picked examples, but rather on a larger body of literature so that we know what the totality of the literature may say. This does raise a question of whether that totality is adequate or not, but nonetheless, we know a good deal more by looking at the entirety of the literature rather than some industry-specific or case-specific example. So the full, and this also, there also is a meta-analysis approach that that one can apply to such a compilation. So in the analysis that I spearheaded, we surveyed literally hundreds of academic studies and imposed various criteria on the studies to be acceptable for the final database of merger experiences. These needed to be largely or entirely horizontal mergers just for the sake of consistency. They were strictly within the U.S., putting aside issues that I think have been mentioned that are raised by mergers and studies of mergers in other jurisdictions. These had to look at final outcomes, prices or quality, rather than intermediate steps, for example, some switching costs or impediments in other fashion that don't automatically translate into a final consumer metric. And perhaps most centrally, they needed to use state-of-the-art standard economic techniques for controlling for other factors. Difference in difference, of course, being the general rule, though there now are more ways and issues, more ways of attacking that question. And finally, these needed to be published in a peer-reviewed journal or in one of a couple respected working paper series, including that by the FTC. So in brief, the result of this compilation was really two different categories of mergers, of studied mergers. One was individually studied mergers. Again, these provided the greatest detail, the most granular information about mergers, and allowed for the greatest opportunity to draw inferences. So there were about 50 mergers. Some of them studied multiple times. Those were of interest for the reasons that have been mentioned, because that provides some insight into whether there's consistency in the findings across different studies of the same merger. There were about 50 such mergers from about 60 studies. Again, some cases of mergers were studied multiple times across 16 different industries. And we identified 120 individually studied products. Again, multiple products oftentimes were studied within the same industry. So that was one category, the individually studied mergers. The other category were studies that looked at aggregates of mergers. So there was a single case, a single study of aggregate of mergers ranging from 10 to 1,000 such mergers. And what those provided was less detailed indications or evidence about them. So the results of this analysis were published in my book, and roughly there was good news and bad news with respect to policy in there. What it showed is that there was a fair number of instances, a good bit of evidence rather, showing that agencies made good decisions as to what mergers to challenge. But it also showed that the number of cases where mergers were approved ended up with many instances of anti-competitive price increases nonetheless. And with respect to remedies, I found a rather erratic pattern, which is to say some remedies were effective and not infrequently, to the contrary, some remedies were less effective. So in short, I think that while my work has been focused on the third of these, the compilation of studies and the effort to extract broad conclusions, all of these techniques are valuable, and all of these techniques, I think, are examples of excellent public policy by the FTC and, unfortunately, less by the DOJ, but certainly for academic researchers as well. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. I'd like to start by having the panelists discuss whether there are certain industries well or poorly suited to study using conventional merger retrospective techniques. For example, many merger retrospectives focus on industries with localized geographic markets and they examine how prices change in the affected markets relative to unaffected markets. But how might a researcher deal with a merger in an industry that has a national market and there might not be an obvious control group?
Sure.
Anyone can,
Yep.
Who wants to jump on that?
So if I may, unless we're going to have a separate discussion on differences and differences, are we? We are.
Yeah.
Okay, then just talking about the industries, I would say that that the methodology allows for is not the most simplified version of differences and differences, where you have a treatment group of say merging parties and a control group that don't merge, is the most simplified version that there is. Certainly, there's a risk if you're studying in the same geographic market of a spillover effect if there's an oligopoly pricing situation going on. Others have noted that problem. I would say that when we're talking about a national market, the challenge is the same, which is to try to identify either subsegments or certain kinds of products that are less likely to be affected by the transaction in question. There are matching methodologies that one could use to do that, something also called synthetic controls, where you try to identify treatments and controls that have similar trends in your outcome measures before a transaction. And that can be, to some degree, a test of the assumption that the control group has similar behavior to the treatment group. So whereas it might not appear as obvious as when there are multiple geographic markets, I think that the approach is not dissimilar.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think, as you were pointing out, that the challenge is if it's a national market, in some ways you're basically getting in one observation of the market, the concentration change. The other thing I would just add to that, and this is in some ways just thinking out loud, but it might be worth at least thinking about exploring, because of the difficulty often in trying to find what a proper control would be, is we in economics have slowly but surely been opening ourselves to the possibility of using certain machine learning techniques in some of our analysis, and it might be worth at least thinking about, are there ways to use some machine learning techniques to get some meaningful predictions for that market in the counterfactual that the merger didn't take place, and use that as a comparison point. But I'm not advocating that necessarily is going to work, but I think it's something worth thinking about. That at least came to mind because I think there is just this inherent difficulty of trying to figure out what is a reasonable comparison point at the national level.
No, I was just going to add that there have been studies that have done hybrid approaches. I mean, so you can obviously just try and model the price formation in a given product. I mean, if you had enough demand and supply shifters, in theory, you don't need a control market. Obviously, for lots of products, that's not possible. But you could do, and I think Vita and Sacker in a hospital paper did this, where they had a control market, but there were some potential issues with supply and demand shifters in the control market. And so you could have a control market, but then also have additional variables trying to control for differences between the control and not. And as Limor mentioned, there's more work on synthetic controls as well.
I think everything that I was about to offer, with one exception, may already have been said, and that is that the problem of control groups, of course, is broader than the case simply of a national market. It's oftentimes, it's fair, I think, to say that maybe the principal challenge in doing a retrospective is to find the right control group. There are other statistical and modeling issues as well, but finding a set of experiences that are a set of events rather unaffected by the merger is oftentimes not so easy to do if one thinks broadly about the way industries adjust to new equilibria as a result of an event. So, for example, in airline mergers, it's common to take markets where the two parties, let's say, the two incumbents on overlap markets are not present. On the other hand, there could be more systematic cost experiences that flow across one of the merging parties that affect their performance in other markets, or network issues that affect their performance in other markets. And all of those, oftentimes, I think many of those are oftentimes not adequately reflected in the design of retrospectives.
So, I mean, are there certain industries maybe that are better suited for qualitative analysis than statistical analysis. In addition to an instance where you might have a national market, sometimes prices are particularly hard to measure, for example, in a service industry where each customer is paying a slightly different price.
We can go in order, or?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say absolutely qualitative analysis ought to accompany quantitative analysis. I want to hesitate to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and to remind us all that hedonic models are often reasonable in controlling for features of products, differentiated products markets. Certainly in healthcare, we've got prices that depend not only on the features of the provider, but also on the health conditions and costs associated with caring for the patient who is consuming the service, because the price varies based on those conditions. And yet somehow we tend to focus on price, which is really hard to measure, in part because of some of the issues around multiple quality dimensions and which ones are you observing, and this question of what's called p-hacking. If you look at enough of them, you'll find some that are significant, and what's happening to quality measures that we aren't observing. So price, even if hard to construct, often is a very nice summary measure, although I'd be the first to say that we overemphasize it. I go further on this qualitative versus quantitative. One of the reasons some might think qualitative analysis is so important is because there are these dimensions of quality that are really meaningful that you want to be able to study. And I would just say that it is possible to quantitatively study these unobserved features using structural models that estimate, right, the magnitude of these and consumers' preferences for them. So I wouldn't say that because quality is important, therefore it becomes often largely qualitative, even if it's multidimensional, just that you need methodologies that are a little trickier to explain in court.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Those are great points. I guess when I was thinking about this issue, the way I look at it is, I think as Lee put, I don't think it has to be necessarily either or. When I think about it, the question becomes, any model that you might use is going to rely on some assumptions that you make. There are decisions that any modeler has to make to execute. And I think it was Chris or John that was making that point, some stated, some unstated. And so, it's, even if it's a complicated market where you do have these subtle differences between whatever products that are actually being sold, in some ways the question becomes, what level of assumptions am I willing to make to be able to make that model estimable and believable? And can I simply use qualitative analysis to inform, the justifiability of those assumptions? So I guess I don't look at it as, because it becomes complicated to quantitatively assess this, then we should just go to qualitative. I think it's a matter of, if we're going to use quantitative methods and it becomes complicated, we got to use more assumptions. That does, knock into some of the credibility of it. But then qualitative analysis can help us to, add some credibility to some of the necessary assumptions you might have to make to actually make those models work.
I mean, I guess one of the things to really think hard about today and in general is, a high percentage of the merger retrospectives have come out of a small number of industries where pricing data is fairly available, where the difference methodology is, sort of easier to apply. And so I think, we have lots of different ways of getting at this question, but essentially the argument is how do we broaden the methodologies of doing merger retrospectives so that we can, get at other industries where price is not one of the most important variables and it's readily available.
Well, let me add a couple points. One is that there's, of course, a tendency in the literature, as everyone agrees and knows, to look at price. And then we bemoan the lack of studies on the quality side. But these are not necessarily independent, or should not be independent. And here I'll have to acknowledge Dennis Carlton's point. Let me steal perhaps some of what you might perhaps were going to say later on. But for example, if we observe in a particular industry that price falls as a result of the merger, it could be associated with a decrease in quality. or if the price increases, it could be because quality has increased. Looking at price by itself, therefore, is at best incomplete and at worst quite misleading about what the full effects of a merger may be. So if we want to raise the stakes and the degree of difficulty of doing merger retrospectives, I think it's fair to say that we need to pay close attention to the way that firms going through a merger adjust, both on the price and quality dimensions, because those are one and the same decision, and that's often not the way that retrospectives examine them.
So even when we have reasonable controls available and reliable data on market outcomes, whether it be price or quality, how does one deal with contemporaneous events that might threaten identification of merger effects? For example, a merger might involve a firm that's financially distressed, and that financial condition of the firm could potentially affect market outcomes. Start, Leamore. You've done stuff along this line.
Okay, well, that is a tough situation. There's always this assumption that your counterfactual, be it maybe machine learning informed prediction of how the outcome would have evolved in the absence of a merger, or a set of controls whose conduct is proxying for what would happen to the merged market or parties in the absence of a merger. There's always the possibility of some shock that causes market fluctuations, and that's fine unless the control group responds differently than does the merging parties, or than do the merging parties. One way to try to get comfortable with that, or see whether your control group is going to be valid, is to look at the pre-merger period and confirm that even in the wake of market changes, the treatment and control have similar trends. That's called the parallel trends assumption. But it remains a threat that even if you satisfy the parallel trends assumption in the pre-period, that in the post-period something happens, and that's where you would like some qualitative analysis to confirm whether it seems like a plausible assumption.
Yeah, I guess the way I always frame this is, I mean, that's kind of the killer when it comes to diff and diff analysis, right? So anytime you teach diff and diff methods, when I talk about, what are these vulnerable to, what you're describing is exactly what I would say, right? It's when you have concurrent changes to the treated group, right, at the exact same time of the treatment that you are focused on. And so then how can you say it's the treatment that's causing the outcome change when it could be this other concurrent event that happened that was specific to the treated group as well? And as I was thinking about this, how do you get around that, right? So any empirical method, I think, always has vulnerabilities, and I think this is the primary vulnerability of diff and diff analysis. And so, one thing that comes to mind is, and this, of course, is probably asking too much, but, is it possible to find some analysis that deals with what you saw to be the concurrent event under different conditions where the treatment that you're looking at did not happen, right? So then you could try to get a sense of, okay, I know this event happened concurrently with the treatment, right? The treatment being the merger. And then here's what we saw was the impact of that other event, like a bankruptcy, for example. And so then when I see this, what we would then say is kind of the combined effect in the analysis that you're describing, perhaps we could difference the two, right? Or at least do some sort of comparison between the two. At least for me, that seems the most promising defensible approach. But admittedly, that's a big challenge when something like that happens.
So I was wondering if Dan was thinking about refinery outages or something when he was writing that question. No, I mean, fundamentally, the control group difference of difference assumption is difficult to prove, and that's what you're getting at. I mean, I can show you the pre-trends, how they behave, but unless, as Jeff was saying, I have the same kind of event in the pre-period where I can show you that they have behaved in the same way, it's going to be very difficult to prove that. But certainly in the petroleum retrospectives, we've had those types of issues, that there's some sort of outage or formulation change, and trying to show that the control market and the treatment market had the same type of effect. But fundamentally, the treatment control relationship is an assumption that I can try and show you as a reasonable assumption, but I can't prove that those prices always behave in exactly the same way.
So again, I wished I had something constructive and helpful to say here, but let me point out that this is part and a reflection of, I think, a larger issue. Whenever the event, a merger, say, is separated in time from the likely effect, there's simply greater opportunities for other events to intervene. And the implication of that is that certain types of outcomes, for example, on innovation, are much harder to assess because they are subject to lots of influences, and the effect tends to be, of course, separated in time by years, not 2 or 3 years, but perhaps a very long period of time. The implication of that is that certain types of questions are simply harder for merger retrospectives to assess. We don't have good structural models of innovation, and and difference in difference analysis is subject to more disruptive influences in the technique for those types of questions.
Thank you. So as we've discussed, most merger retrospectives examine the impact of horizontal mergers on prices, but I'd like to ask the panelists to consider whether there are other questions that merger retrospectives can or will be likely or unlikely to successfully address. In particular, 2 recent NBER working papers have shown a negative relationship between labor market concentration and wages. Do the panelists think that traditional merger retrospective techniques could be used to add to this literature? And are there unique challenges associated with analyzing labor markets or buyer power as a result from mergers more generally?
Why don't we start there?
We can't keep making you jump out.
So, you know, the issue of labor market effects and monopsony power in labor markets, of course, is relatively new to antitrust, though it's been kicking around amongst labor economists for a rather long period of time. It's a good example of where our silos have really done a disservice to us in thinking about the broader effects. I think that the technique is the difference in difference technique and the general thrust of merger retrospectives is quite capable of dealing with other types, other dimensions. As I've said before, other dimensions of outcomes with respect to mergers. And I also would like to, I guess, broaden the answer by saying that merger retrospectives are useful to the agency in other respects as well. As I said in my opening remarks, merger retrospectives cast some light on the agency's internal decision-making, but they also can cast light on the agency's internal methods of analysis. For example, the use of merger simulations against retrospectives, a comparison that's been made in a couple articles in the literature, or the use of merger retrospectives to evaluate the use of structural criteria, something that I've done a bit of work on as well. So there's a large number of areas where merger retrospectives, I think, have not been deployed to their full advantage just yet.
I mean, mainly, I think this is not so much a question of methodology, but the actual data. To get data at the level where you could look at localized labor markets or other types of these outcomes. I mean, I think one of the issues with some of the literature at this point is the level of disaggregation in the data and trying to look at broad measures of these kind of outcomes.
Yeah, my initial reaction is a lot like Chris's in terms of getting measurements for the data, but I think this also, when I think about it more broadly, this kind of feeds into one of the things I was talking about in my opening remarks, which is, in some ways this is asking, there's a lot more outcomes we could look at. How do we go about that? And I think it's true. I don't see any fundamental reason why the methods we've talked about couldn't apply to these other outcomes. But I just would encourage us all to make sure that we're having a broad perspective on how we make that global choice, right? Because here would be the concern, right? If I were a firm, the worry is if you're going to look at 30 outcomes, right, with these mergers, I'm probably going to fail on one of them, right? And so I think we don't want to get things to that level and be thinking in a disciplined way in terms of what are the set of outcomes that make sense to look at, and think about that in terms of a global analysis. What does this aggregation of results over multiple outcomes really mean in terms of what really the impact of this merger was? So that would be kind of my main perspective on something like this.
So I would say this is a situation where the richness of healthcare data is, again, a huge advantage. I was able in one of my retrospectives to explore monopsony power following insurance mergers using that kind of detailed geographic level data on employment as well as wages and find evidence of post-merger exercise of monopsony power. I would add that that the Department of Justice has challenged some insurance mergers for a variety of reasons, but including allegations of monopsony harm arising from being able to depress the wages of healthcare professionals. What I would say is that thinking about the effects of a transaction on labor markets is challenging, because you want to make sure that you are mindful that employment reductions do not at all necessarily mean monopsony, right? That sometimes they can mean efficiencies. Want to distinguish between the two. That sometimes a transaction can lead to a change in which labor is compensated. And that can raise some serious measurement issues and a change in, bottom line, the production process. So just to pick up specific example, I found evidence that after insurers gained market power, they tended to substitute nurse labor for physician labor, thereby depressing physician wages, right? And so thinking about the implications of that are a little different from holding the production process constant, depressing the wages of physicians by purchasing less of it. So you definitely need some context for that analysis, but it certainly is doable.
So do we think merger retrospectives can measure merger-induced changes in production efficiency, costs, input prices, essentially what we've been talking about, and more broadly, can they be used to test efficiency claims made by the merging parties?
I'm happy to.
I'll go ahead now.
You want to?
Well, I
Take it
thought
away.
I'd switch it up. I feel like we're just going to the corners. I mean, my answer is very quick. I mean, I think this actually kind of layers very cleanly onto the prior question. For me, it just comes down to issues of measurement and, again, thinking about kind of global set of outcomes that you're going to look at. But that's kind of as far as I was ready to take it.
I guess we actually had at least one merger retrospective where we did see efficiencies. I don't know whether the parties had actually raised it in the case, but we did see essentially a pipeline reconfiguration that led to lower retail prices. So, I mean, once again, it's a question of data and being able to identify these type of effects. There's no methodological reason you couldn't look at it.
I agree with that. In my compilation of studies, there were a small number of studies that did look at cost issues, cost results from mergers, as well as efforts to measure at least R&D, if not innovative output, and certain quality dimensions, as Limor and others have mentioned. So there are studies out there that have used the same technique and sought to apply them. It seems to me certainly that one of the places that would have high payoff for observers and certainly for the agencies would be to initiate a more concerted effort to determine whether the effects of mergers do include the efficiencies that the parties have claimed. I think there's anecdotal reason to be skeptical about that, and I think that a final determination really awaits this as one of the focuses of a concerted set of studies.
I just have one comment to add, which is that a number of, at least in healthcare, the assessments of the impacts of merger on costs don't address the issue of merger specificity. So I'll leave it at that.
So, Lemore, you had talked about your research on cross-market hospital mergers, and John, you had talked about some of your work on mergers that eliminate potential competition. I wondered if either of you would mind talking about the challenges of constructing a counterfactual when whether the merger is affecting a broad set of markets, not just the markets where the parties are competing head to head.
So I'm happy to spare Lemore going first again.
Don't mind.
Once again, the sad truth is that the study that I conducted along with Jen Yushil-Makina was in airlines. Where else would it be? Airlines offers not just a lot of data, making it an inviting target for lots of graduate students and attention by others as well. But in the case of airlines, there's a greater ability to identify who a potential competitor might be. And there's a fair amount of literature that preceded my work that has identified as a potential competitor a carrier that was positioned by virtue of operating at one or both endpoints to quickly enter the market. And the argument, of course, is that an incumbent clearly understands that there's a threat of entry and the prospect of entry if it might fully exercise its own market power on the route. The incumbent recognizes that, and so it arguably affects its behavior. So the question we found, in short, that there was an effect from a merger that eliminated such a threatening competitor, and the effect was about half the size of the effect of the routes where the two incumbents merged. But again, the question then becomes, and I've challenged many of my grad students to figure this out, what other industries can we find where there is some reasonably objective identification of who a potential competitor might be so one can run such a set of tests elsewhere? That's not an easy question to answer. The work by Florian Ederer and others in the pharmaceutical area is a good illustration of important work, but it also illustrates the gigantic amount of work that's involved in identifying who may be prospectively competing with a drug development program on the part of the acquiring company. But so there are great challenges. It's not to say that people cannot identify industries and potential competitors, but the identification of potential competitors needs to be defensible. And if it's not, then the studies are correspondingly weaker in the quality and strength of their conclusions.
Thanks for describing that work, actually. The lack of insights on the impact of eliminating potential competition, I think, is a real barrier to enforcement agencies and to courts in weighing that more heavily in transactions. And this new work is, I think, really important and useful. So I'm glad that you're on it. The project on cross-market mergers originated when I was at the Federal Trade Commission. I was here. Everyone was I don't want to say have it nailed because it is a challenge, but the staff here and the attorneys and the economists worked together very well on the mergers of hospitals that were head-to-head rivals for the same patients and trying to figure out which of those were potentially problematic. Same goes for other provider services. But what I was hearing a lot about prior to coming as a deputy at the FTC was insurers complaining that hospitals were merging into broader regional systems and now national systems, and that they were negotiating higher and higher prices, and that the authorities were not investigating or taking seriously the potential harm from these transactions. So that to me was kind of marching orders when I left and had more time or any time for research. The study came out just this week, finally, in the RAND, co-authored with Kate Ho and Robin Lee. And in it, what we do is we have both a theoretical component and a quantitative component. I'll start with the quantitative component, which is assessing what were, in fact, the price effects of a series of all of the cross-market mergers during an extended period, 2000 to 2012, and also subsets of those. So let me explain. The answer to your question is it's kind of tricky to figure out who might be affected and who might not in this whole issue of treatment and control groups. So to pick one of the empirical analyses we do, we take a set of transactions that were investigated by the Federal Trade Commission because of horizontal overlap. Okay, the cross-market overlap, to the extent that it's investigated, historically certainly wasn't made public. So they were investigated because of horizontal overlap, and the parties continued they merged after the fact. So instead of divesting what was the area of concern, the hospital of concern, they persisted through that investigation. So that leads us to believe it's plausible that those transactions were driven by the desire for that horizontally overlapping hospital. And we focus on bystanders. So bystanders, so plausibly exogenous to them that they happen to be party to a merger where they gained another hospital in a different market. And we focused on if you gained another hospital in the same state versus another state, what's the implication for your prices? And we find that if you gain hospitals in the same state where you're negotiating with the same insurer, that prices go up, and that doesn't happen when you gain partners in other states. Then we broadened it to include a large sample of mergers, all mergers, and we had a different approach to try to get rid of the hospitals that were the motivation for those transactions, again, to focus on the bystanders, and we found more precisely estimated similar results. So quantitatively, the conclusion is that there is, I think, reasonably strong evidence that as at least in the hospital sector, as you gain heft in your state, certainly where you're negotiating with a common intermediary, that you're able to extract higher prices. Now, we know that price increases themselves, that's nowhere in the Clayton Act, that transactions that lead to price increases, and I'm assuming holding quality constant, okay? But the transactions that lead to those, there's nothing that says that that's what the agency can raise a challenge to. They raise challenges when there's a diminution of competition. And so there then goes to the question, which I don't know if we'll discuss now or later in the day, as to what are the mechanisms that are generating these price increases, and are they potentially actionable by antitrust enforcers?
I think that the fact that you had to rely on a lot of industry knowledge in order to set up your research design in that case ties in nicely with another question I had. Are there guiding principles to selecting control products or setting up your research design? And in doing so, is it better to rely on industry-specific knowledge or take a data-driven approach? For example, a researcher might exclude certain control products because their own industry knowledge tells them that those control subjects might be, or control products might be subject to unique demand or cost shocks and might confound measuring merger effects. Alternatively, some folks have talked about using empirical matching techniques where you might select controls based on observable characteristics in the data. I wondered if the panelists could talk about the trade-offs there in terms of relying on making subjective decisions about using industry knowledge versus taking a data-driven approach to selecting control groups and designing your research.
I could
Chris?
start.
Yeah.
Well, it really can't be an either-or. I mean, you want to use the industry knowledge to hopefully identify some candidate control groups and then essentially show that they are behaving the same. I think it would be difficult to simply look at the prices or whatever quality, whatever you're comparing, and show that they act the same, and then not go the extra step to essentially explain why the industry detail would lead you to that conclusion, or vice versa. I think if you started out with just a numerical matching exercise, that you could easily be led astray. But I mean, also, essentially, it has to be both at the same time.
I can jump in. These are issues I like thinking about a lot. I guess the starting point I would go with is it often sounds good to say I used a data-driven approach, right? It's all objective, right? I didn't bring any of my biases into this. But then any of us that have executed these things know that you had to make decisions, right? Some subjectivity comes into this. One thing I always teach my students is even just using OLS, you've made a subjective call here, right? In terms of how you treat outliers, as an example, right? So there's inevitably going to be some subjectivity, even if you use kind of what you might think of as being an objective matching estimator. You have to think about how you construct that model. What are the variables that are going to go in it, right? How do they go in it? So I think there has to be some level of subjectivity. And as long as you acknowledge that, then you might as well bring in your industry knowledge to the best of your ability to help guide the subjective decisions that you inevitably have to make. So I think it's good to think about it starting as a data-driven approach, but recognizing that you have to make calls, and those should be informed by industry knowledge.
I'll just add, of course, you need to make use of your industry knowledge. However, where there may be disputes or where it's not clear one way or the other, you always do your robustness checks and confirm and see how sensitive your findings are to different assumptions that's informing your analysis. I also want to say that it's therefore very important, it's an obvious point, but that some of these retrospectives take place unrelated to litigation or to the prospect of litigation by disinterested parties. Government economists are strong candidates. I think academic economists are candidates, although there are some biases that I am sure arise. I think the commission could also potentially commission some studies, but I do think it's very important, especially because of the sensitivity of results to data decisions, to think about the context in which the analysis is produced.
So Libor's answer suggests another point, not exactly on target here, but the issue of what sort of merger retrospectives are in the public domain is of some interest. What we would like would be a random sample of mergers, and we're 2 or 3 steps short of that in thinking about what's available, for example, in the meta-analysis that I did. Not every study is equally likely to be published. Not every industry is equally likely to be investigated. Not every set of results is of equal interest to the profession or to the journal editor. So there are selection issues all over the place. And for that reason, it's not only important that the researcher who's doing the retrospective be knowledgeable in the industry, but it's also important that any compilation of these studies or anything we attempt to synthesize from a meta-analysis or any other compilation be sensitive to these kinds of forces that are really not germane to the question of the broader questions that may interest us as well. All hospital mergers, for example, or all mergers about which retrospectives have been done, which is my database.
We have a question from the audience. The question is, the panel is focused on mergers, but can the group talk about retrospectives or competitive studies that focus on conduct? I assume, anti-competitive conduct investigations or cases. What would be, and what would the issues with such studies be? I'm not aware of any retrospectives that investigate a particular conduct investigation or case.
Pay for delay.
Go ahead, Lamar.
So the one that comes to mind is pay for delay, and there's at least one FTC produced study that provides an estimate of what is the cost to consumers as a result of that piece of conduct, it's widely believed to be an underestimate. At the same time, there's real selection issues with that, like which products did the pharmaceutical companies in fact elect for engaging in pay for delay? Were they products that were, had the weakest patents and therefore cause potentially greater harm? And is that greater harm captured in this estimate because a generic could have entered sooner? So there's a lot of selection issues that arise in those kinds of studies, just as they would in merger retrospectives.
So as we all know, there are really three pillars of antitrust: cartels, merger enforcement, and conduct. There are hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands of studies of cartels. John Connor's work was really seminal in this area, and we learned a great deal about cartel outcomes, formation, duration, that sort of thing from John's work, and I took some of my inspiration from his work. He, of course, he cast his net very widely. He included lots of studies that I think were of varying quality, which simply reflects the fact that there are different ways of doing meta-analysis. But it's easy to do cartel stuff, and there's also an incentive to do cartel studies because these are subject to challenge and rewards to winning plaintiffs, treble damages and the like, and that has prompted over a period of time, I think, a flurry of studies in that area. In the merger area, of course, there's fewer for a lot of those reasons, and there are fewer yet that look at conduct, and there the issue is trying to find a control sample of any degree of reliability. Conduct cases tend to be sui generis. Very difficult to identify who it is, has not been subject to conduct by one of the major tech companies, for example, if that's the concern. So there are efforts to draw comparisons, but I wouldn't call them retrospectives. Efforts to draw comparisons, for example, between the U.S. and EU practice with respect to certain types of challenges to the tech companies, and those have produced some insights, but they're hardly quantitative, and they're certainly not invulnerable to criticism about their idiosyncratic nature. Still, the conduct area is another largely unexplored area, but there I think the challenges really lie with the ability to construct a reliable study along the lines of those that are now being done in mergers.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, I mean, you would need a conduct investigation that you had a clear starting point on, a clear ending point, and then a comparison group. I mean, there's certainly lots of studies out there about regulations and changes in regulations and the effects, price or quantity effects on regulation. So it would essentially be the same, be an analogous methodology, but you would have to find instances that lend themselves to estimation.
Okay. Many retrospectives are agnostic about the underlying economic model of competition. However, some do incorporate some structure from economic models. For example, Ashenfelter, Hoskin, and Weinberg's 2015 RAND paper disentangles market power effects from efficiency effects by using differential changes, by examining or allowing price effects to vary based on differential changes in shipping costs and changes in concentration. Another example is Miller and Weinberg's 2017 Econometrica paper, which estimates a model of Nash-Bertrand competition in order to disentangle unilateral effects from coordinated effects. I was hoping the panelists could discuss some of the benefits and costs of adding structure from economic models.
Sure.
Go ahead.
All right. I think that I'll say the basics, and then please embellish on that. There are enormous benefits to adding structure, as the economist would say, and I think I'll try to explain for non-economists in the audience. Basically, what that means is instead of this construct of let's have a treatment control, like a randomized controlled trial, where you look at kind of what happened as a result of the merger relative to the counterfactual in your control group, the structure means that you basically create a set of equations that 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 if you get the parameters in those equations as close to generating the data that you observe as possible. So a set of equations that describe a market that have different factors in those equations, including things like costs and dimensions of your product and how sensitive demand is to dimensions of those products and the prices of them and so forth. So a fairly comprehensive numerical model of the world. And the advantage of these structural models is then, instead of just being able to say, as you do in the difference in difference merger retrospective, here's what happened, you can say, here's what you would expect to happen when these two parties combine. We simulate it, we predict it, and we can show you how it compares. But we can also show you what would happen if we didn't have all or nothing bargaining because, say, we banned that. We can also show you what happens if we require this product to stay on the market for a certain amount of time. So you can test your different potential merger remedies. You could also control for changes in the market that you become aware of after the fact. So when you were asking us about confounding factors, if you had a structural model of the market, you could say, because it's well known that the price of corn increased so much, we would have expected some change in this marketplace anyway. Let's up the price of corn so we can control for that throughout all of the different components, and then see how just the existence of co-ownership impacted the outcome. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. There's a trade-off. You have to explain it. And you also have to feel pretty confident that the market you're modeling is in equilibrium when you're modeling it. Otherwise, there's lack of stability for all of those parameter estimates, and you need an extraordinary amount of data.
Yeah, very well summarized. So yeah, if I was going to boil it down when I think about the trade-offs, summarize the benefits, I look at it in terms of counterfactuals and, let's see, what was the other one? I can do counterfactuals and mechanisms, right? So you can think about, as Lee Moore said, I can think about situations I haven't seen, but the model can allow me to make predictions about what will happen. And then because you put in the structure, you think about demand and supply, I put structure on that, for example, then I can really dig into what do I think is the mechanism by which, this change that I'm considering actually filters into the outcome that I'm looking at. And then in terms of cost, I guess the best way I'd summarize it is risk of misspecification, right? So there's, as Lee Moore said, you're assuming that the market's in equilibrium. Maybe that's not true. How much of a consequence is that? And then, of course, there's other, as I've been saying along, there's other decisions that you inevitably have to make, things like functional form assumptions, distribution assumptions on the components that you put into the model. How consequential are those? Gets into robustness issues, things like that. But yeah, those are the key trade-offs that I often think about.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think that's well stated.
That's fine. So I think we can finish here with come back to some of the requirements of a successful merger retrospective study, both in terms of data and in terms of ability to develop a reasonable counterfactual. We've gone over this a lot already, and we've talked about differences a lot already. And one of the features there is that it requires data not only on the products of the merging parties, but also on a set of controlled products which were unaffected by the merger, but otherwise experience similar demand and supply conditions. And I'd like the panelists to think about, are there any empirical techniques that have either been used or maybe there's some promise for use in the future that require less data, that don't require measuring changes in prices or market outcomes over time in two different sets of markets?
I mean, I think we've gotten to where we are with difference in difference because it makes less demands on the data than a lot of the other methodologies that are out there. So I'm not sure how we're going to reduce the demands from there.
I would agree with that and simply add that if one looks at the set of studies that have been done over time, there is significantly increased sophistication in them. Attention to issues, attention to control group issues, issues of heterogeneity, issues of serial correlation, and these are issues, I think, that increasingly are understood to be part and parcel of what one needs to bring to these studies. So I think that the diff and diff is well established for the reasons that Chris mentions. It's hard to beat it, but within that model, within that regime, there certainly has been improvements along the way.
I don't see them getting simpler. I'd say in cases where the agency has good reason to understand the counterfactual, that pre versus post analysis can be useful, particularly if the markets are well known and relatively stable. But it's not usually your preferred version.
Okay. I think that wraps up the first session. Thank you.
Well, that was interesting.
Questions, I have no idea.
Prospective merger analysis. We have 4 speakers who've all conducted studies which have been explicitly designed to use merger retrospectives to tell us something about how to improve enforcement tools. We have Chris Garman from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Chris worked at the FTC for a long time too, so he's very familiar with what we do. Angelique Mina is an attorney in our compliance group, and she also has a long background in merger review. Frank Verboven from KU Leuven has a recent study that's looked at testing merger simulation, and Matt Weinberg, who I've written papers with for a really long time now, will also be describing his work. So why don't you start, Chris?
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the organizers and Dan for inviting me back to the FTC. It's great to be back here, see all the familiar faces, and talk about merger retrospectives and how we can use them to inform prospective merger analysis. And what I'm going to be talking about, hospitals in particular, and what I've done research to inform prospective merger analysis for hospitals. So let's see, how do I advance the, is it this?
Yeah.
Okay, the big button?
Big button.
All right. So as the chairman mentioned at the beginning, in the 90s, there was a big losing streak in hospital merger enforcement. I believe 8 straight losses for hospital merger challenges, and it looked like the merger enforcement was close to dead around the turn of the century. And Chairman Muris at the time decided to institute a merger litigation task force, and also the Hospital Merger Retrospectives Project, which took a handful of hospital mergers and did a deep dive on what happened after those mergers, with subpoenas for getting claims data and interviews and the like. I think the 2 big lessons we learned from that project was that there were a couple of losses in the 90s where the merging parties were successful in making the argument that, yeah, we're going to get market power, but we're nonprofit hospitals, so we have the community's interest at heart, and we're not going to exercise it. So you can trust us to do what's best for the community. And this project was established with a couple of nonprofit hospital mergers that there can be cases where nonprofit hospital mergers will exercise the market power that they get, and so nonprofit hospital mergers can be anti-competitive. And there are also a number of more cases in the 90s where the geographic markets were defined by the courts as being very large, using the Elzenga-Hogarty test primarily. And these, the Merger Retrospectives Project, finding that there were a merger in Chicago and a merger in the Bay Area led to large price increases, showed that you can have anti-competitive mergers in urban areas where a technique like the Elzenga-Hogarty test would define a very broad geographic market. So one thing that the Merger Retrospectives Project did not do was look at or evaluate prospective merger tools. And, but at the same time, in the early 2000s, some papers were Town and Business, Capstrano-Satterthwaite developed some new tools to analyze hospital mergers prospectively. And later in that decade and in the recent years, those new tools, diversion ratios, willingness to pay, upward pricing pressure, have been used in actual court cases and successfully by the FTC and the state antitrust agencies. The natural question is, are these new techniques and tools accurate in predicting post-merger effects? So what I did in my paper, I looked at 28 consummated hospital mergers of competing hospitals, and then calculated these screens, willingness to pay, upward pricing pressure, and a sort of reduced form merger simulation using pre-merger data, the data that would be available to an enforcer during that initial investigation. And and use the price method, estimation method that Lee Daphne used in her 2009 hospital merger paper, which is really needed to get a sample size this large. Trying to get claims data for this level of this number of hospital mergers was difficult at the time, since the Cooper et al. Paper has been able to look at hospital mergers using claims data, but I was not able to when I started this project. The price change was measured for each merger relative to a synthetic control, and I also looked at the change in the costs for each merger, post-merger change in costs, measure of average variable cost. And the point of doing that is to evaluate these screens. They are meant to capture the loss of competition from a merger. They're not meant, just like you can think of a normal HHI, you're looking at what would the loss of competition be. So this evaluation should emphasize this is looking at how well do these screens, how accurate are they for seeing which mergers should be investigated more thoroughly, not how well do they identify anti-competitive cases. So looking at the HHIs, and this is consistent with what the Merger Retrospectives project found, they lead to a lot of false negatives. If you look at an HHI on a broad area, a hospital referral region, that would approximate what an Elzinga-Hogarty market would be, it leads to a number of false negatives. If you do the opposite and look at a market that's relatively small, a hospital service area, that basically flags every merger as anti-competitive, so that's not very effective as a screen. And what I found is that the new measures, willingness to pay and upward pricing pressure, were more accurate in flagging mergers to be investigated further. And in fact, for upward pricing pressure, minimum upward pricing pressure of greater than 4%, that gives you the most correct predictions and no false negatives. So if you're really thinking about this as using it to flag mergers for further investigation, that would be a better than using, not ideal, but better than using the HHI. But when you look at the relationship between post-merger price changes and change in willingness to pay, for instance, the UPP graph is roughly the same. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of variation that's unexplained by willingness to pay. I think that goes to the fact that willingness to pay and upward pricing pressure, although they're better at flagging potentially anti-competitive mergers, they're still relatively crude, and there's a lot that they don't explain about what's happening after a merger. The limitations of this approach, I think there are two big ones. First, and this Dennis Carlton, as far as I know, is the first one to highlight this, there's a selection bias. Those mergers that are most anti-competitive would most likely be deterred or be challenged, successfully challenged. So the consummated mergers you have to select from tend to be more concentrated in those that are innocuous or pro-competitive. And then there are lots of other effects of a merger that are merger specific and they relate to price, but they're not necessarily related to competition. If you get a hospital system that merges, that acquires a new hospital and they have better negotiators, they can negotiate a better price. That's not a competitive effect, but that can be a merger-specific effect. And so I think that effects like that could explain some of this noise. So that's why I think complementing this merger retrospectives approach with approaches like Dave Ballin and Keith Brand's working paper on simulating hospital merger simulations, where they use a Monte Carlo-like approach to test these screens against the solutions to a Nash-Nash bargaining model. They serve as a good complement, and both of those together show that the new merger screens do a better job than HHI for flagging potentially anti-competitive mergers. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for organizing this event and for inviting me also to this event. So I will talk in this 10 minutes. I will start with sharing my insights on a study we did on the about one market in Sweden. It's about painkillers, and where there was a very large merger. So that's the unique distinguishing feature. So it was a large merger. And I was also working on the case with people from the Swedish Competition Authority, and we predicted with a merger simulation model large effects. But then the merger, for other reasons, was accepted. And we then did an ex post analysis. So what is nice about this merger is that we could, since the merger effects were so large, we can test a lot more details, a lot more nitty-gritty than one can do often in other ex post analysis. So we could look at price effects by brand and at market share effects by brand. And then we have a supply side and a demand side in the model. So in the demand side, we distinguish between basically a unit demand and otherwise constant expenditure model, so meaning price is linear or log. So the usual literature takes it to be linear. And then we also compare a simple nested logit with a random coefficient logit. And then on the supply side, we also do several things. So we account for, in a very simple way, for deviations from the most common assumption Bertrand-Nash behavior before the merger. And then we allow, when we do the ex post analysis, we also look at because we try to explain what happened and where the model fits well and does not fit well, we look at whether also cost changes might have occurred after the merger. So what do we find? So we find that functional forms matter, not surprisingly. So in our setting, but this is not necessarily general, the unit demand model performed worse. So in the sense that one would get markups or elasticities which would increase a lot across products just because they are more expensive. And that issue does not arise in the constant expenditure model. Also, the unit demand somewhat underpredicts or largely underpredicts the expected price effects. On substitution patterns, so basically how the different products compete with each other. So here, random coefficient versus nested logit, they both they don't seem to do much better or worse than each other. So the random coefficients model somewhat underpredicts price effects, but then it also better predicts the market share effects. So in the rest then of the paper, we then studied, we focused on the log price model, constant expenditures, and we compare then the other two models, random coefficient, nested logit, in more detail. And at the supply side, we see that the predictions on average seem to be quite well. But since the effects are so large, as I said, you can also dig deeper. And so we do find anomalies that the models cannot predict very well or not perfectly at least. So the outsiders price responses, so they tend to be larger than predicted, at least for some, not for all. And then what we found is in the ex post analysis that the price increases of the two merging firms, they are the same percentage amount, while the model would predict that the smaller firm would raise prices by more. So that is another anomaly. And then factors that can explain this gap. So basically the outsider price responses. So the usual way to think about it, of course, is that there might be some kind of tacit coordination going on. But we also consider there's a cost increase that's plausible. So in this case, so it's about painkillers. So package size was actually reduced at the same time as the price per tablet was increased. So that raises costs also, and that we did a regression analysis to kind of validate that at least part of the price increase was due to a cost increase. So insiders price responses, so as I said, so there's some difference between the small and the large firm, and it could be that there was a possible cost advantage, so there's a typo there to the smaller firm that could explain the findings. So then the broader lessons, because I just talked essentially about one observation, but I think it's an observation that we looked at a lot, so I hope it has more weight than the usual one observation in a data set. So what are the broader lessons? So basically, for any demand model, so it's key to capture the main dimensions of product differentiation. So there's discussion in demand literature, should you use a simplified nested logit or a more complicated random coefficient? That's, of course, a very important discussion. But, we should mainly not forget that we should take care of basically capturing the relevant dimensions of differentiation. So in this case, I forgot to say, but basically there was a merger where the two firms, they conquered, or they got 100% of the market in one of the three segments. So, but then the key question was, of course, whether these segments, whether they matter from the consumer's perspective or not. So, and the nested logit captures this well, but other models could also capture that by including random coefficients for these segments. And functional forms on the demand side, they do matter. So log models predict bigger effects. But maybe with efficiencies, this is not so important. If you but at least if you just look at it without efficiencies, then they have higher predictions. So that basically our conclusion is that sensitivity analysis is desirable. From the supply side, it's important to. We had a model where basically we allowed for non-coordinated conduct, or we allowed for having coordinated conduct already before the merger. The reason was that we looked at costs, and the markups from outside information were higher than basically predicted by a standard Bertrand model. So that's why we allowed for some kind of pre-merger coordinated conduct. And basically the broader lesson is that one should try to incorporate such prior information. When a final comment or broader lesson is that, because I think one of the purposes of this session is to see whether basically evaluating merger simulation as a tool. So one should try as much as possible when we see that things differ after the merger, one should try to take care as much as possible for any factors that could have changed. So, for example, efficiencies that happened after the merger maybe affected some products of the merging firms differently than others, and also coinciding cost change or quality changes. So, some very brief remarks on future research on doing merger retrospectives. So, I think, it's very important to have more observations. So we have very few observations on mergers. Retrospective, and especially, we have lots, as we've discussed today, but about evaluating merger simulation, I think there's room for a lot more. And this is also academically, I think, very interesting, because a lot of case studies, I think you can learn a lot from all the qualitative analysis as well. One, apart from merger simulation, maybe price concentration analysis could also be interesting, like maybe in airline markets. In Europe, this has been analyzed a lot. This tool has been used a lot, so maybe in the US as well. I think also retrospectives on, for example, auctions, like when there is mergers between firms where auctions are important, that's definitely interesting, and the same for vertical mergers. One thing I want to emphasize is it's also interesting to look at longer-term effects. So the study that we did about painkillers, so there was a short-term, we looked at the short-term effects, so 2 years before and after the merger. But we do have more data, and when I had a look at it last week, you see that the huge price increases that happened after the merger, they are no longer that visible several years later. So I think long-term analysis is also important. Evaluating non-price effect and efficiency claims are important. And so just as a general conclusion, I would like to say that I think merger retrospectives are very useful to evaluate these tools, and I think they would also be interested. There are costs involved, but I think there's also academic benefits from learning more about this, and of course there's also challenges and that we have to meet. Yeah, thanks.
click the slides? The big button, the green. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, thanks for organizing, Dan, and everybody else. Really happy to be here. I'm going to talk about two sets of papers today that are related to this topic of how retrospectives can be used to improve prospective merger analysis. And they have a common theme, but they focus on slightly different features of the problem. So the common theme is looking at this basic model of competition that's very useful. It's a framework. It's like the maybe main framework for thinking about the lion's share of mergers that's built on kind of three parts. The first part has to do with basically summarizing how people would switch from product to product given changes in their prices. Of course, that forms pricing incentives. The next step is thinking about a model of competition. The typical thing is to think about the main locus of competition being prices. The next step is figuring out, given that assumption about how firms compete, what sort of costs would be necessary to rationalize what you see in the data. And then the third step is, the interesting step, which is given how people would substitute in this model of competition, how would prices change if a subset of products were combined in one portfolio, right? So really the question is, what are the pricing incentives for multi-product firms? That's kind of the big question, right? So the first set of papers I want to talk about are really closely related to what Frank just discussed, and Chris as well. So the first set of papers, one with Dan, the other one is a more limited analysis on the same theme. What these papers did was very similar. So what we did is we used only information that you have had ex ante before two mergers in the first paper and one more merger in the other paper were consummated. So we had scanner data on prices and quantities in a couple of consumer product markets. And we did those three steps that I just described and computed predictions about how prices would change after these mergers went through, if they were to go through. For whatever reason, these mergers were approved, and we then added to the sample data that was generated after the fact and looked before and after, directly what happened to prices, and compared the predictions with these more direct measures that use data ex post, right? So we tried to be sensitive to some of the issues that Frank brought up. And one issue that comes up in these models is, of course, functional form does matter, right? It's well known that not only does getting good measures of who competes with whom through cross-price elasticities or diversion ratios, of course, that's fundamental, right? But also, given two different demand systems that have kind of the same implications about who competes with whom at pre-merger prices, but different implications about how rapidly prices become more elastic as you move away from pre-merger equilibria, that matters too, right? So you can calibrate two different demand systems that have the exact same pre-merger elasticities, plug them into a merger simulation, you get really different numbers, right? In other words, the second derivative matters. Another way to think about this is exactly who the switchers are, given a price increase, and that matters quite a bit in how these things go through. So we focused on kind of bread and butter basic demand systems that were kind of off the shelf back then, and did a pretty thorough sensitivity analysis to different specifications of demand and different ways that you might go about estimating that given information that might be available if you were actually reviewing one of these things. Right? So just backing up a little bit, the three different packaged consumer product markets that we focused on were some that Dan and Orly had looked at in a previous paper. And maybe they're not the most exciting products in the world, but we thought that they might be good fits for this sort of analysis. They were pretty stable. They were pretty simple. There weren't that many products in the market. So the kind of demand systems that we're talking about here were really simple versions that were kind of off the shelf back then. They all had the kind of basic form. Well, two of them that we put a lot of emphasis on had this basic form of some measure of Q on all the prices, right? There are substitutes in there, so you need all the prices in there. one key limiting factor on the ability to use those models is how many products you need independent variation in the prices of to be able to estimate them, right? They all have to shift independently of one another and for reasons that are not related to demand shocks, hopefully, right? So there weren't a lot of products in these markets. They were stable, not a lot of entry and exit and so on. You know, that's what we focused on. So what we found is that they're sensitive to demand, not surprising. We then did this other step of trying to explore the forecast error in a sense, trying to explore the bias. And we looked at the usual suspects, right? We then added to the sample information that you would have not had if you were reviewing one of these things, but you would have had ex post. And so we looked to see if like shifts in demand explain this, are there plausible changes in marginal costs that could explain this, and so on. And we weren't really that successful, to be honest, at isolating exactly what it was that caused these things to go off. It was a challenge. So the next study that I want to talk about takes a slightly different focus on this. So here, what we did is we really tried to focus on one reason why these models might go off. And that's this assumption that the way that firms compete is static portraying competition through prices over and over again without kind of thinking about the past, just repeatedly, non-cooperatively setting your prices over and over again. So we focused on this merger in the beer industry, and the approach was some ways similar, some ways different. So what we did is we used all of the data both before and after the merger to estimate demand, right? So that kind of like limits demand for, kind of like, in a sense, we hope that we kind of like know what demand is before and after, so that's not going to explain why we're kind of shutting that down as an explanation for why prices are moving, right? We're modeling that. And tried to focus more on this assumption of conduct. All right, let me step back a minute and tell you a little bit about the industry. So the specific merger that we're looking on to try and understand the way firms are competing in the beer industry was one between Miller and Coors. At the time, this was the second and the third biggest firm in the industry. The biggest was Anheuser-Busch InBev. And they made all the brands that everybody knows, kind of the famous macro brewers. At that point in time, in the channels of sales that we had access to, these were still like upper 80% of market share. So it was a big share of the market. It was approved by the DOJ after a pretty thorough review in 2008, and for a pretty interesting reason. So this is something I first became aware of through reading one of these year in review articles that comes out in the Review of I/O, which is a great piece of qualitative information about what people were thinking about in mergers. And here it's pretty interesting. So this merger is combining products that are probably really close substitutes, not a lot of other competition for that segment of the market. But on the other hand, for historical reasons, Coors was almost all brewed in one location in Colorado. Miller, on the other hand, had 6 plants spread out across the United States. And that was the efficiency rationale. Beer's mostly water, it's bulky and it's heavy. They were going to move the production of primarily Coors brands into the Miller plants and reduce the shipping distances to retailers, right? So that, in conjunction with what I think were probably demand estimates that implied the closest competitive threat to both Miller and to Coors was the big firm, Budweiser, together suggested this wasn't going to really do much to upper pricing pressure. That's my guess. So what we did is we got as long a time series of data as we could. It spans from 2000 up to the end of 2011. And we did something really simple to start. We just plotted the average price of a 12-pack of beer for the main brewers, and also for more distant substitutes, Corona and Heineken. So the first figure on the left shows that after at least 7 years of kind of a stable decline in real prices for Miller Lite, Coors Light, and Bud Light, the main beers produced by these firms and produced in this segment of the market that we're focusing on, you see a pretty abrupt price increase over the 3 months after the merger, the date of which is indicated by that vertical red line. Over the same time period, to my eye, Corona and Heineken prices kind of continue falling at a pre-existing trend. So So what's surprising about this? Well, one, it's a pretty stark price increase for Miller and Coors, the two products of the merging firms. The other thing that's somewhat surprising about this is that a competing firm, Budweiser, matches the price increase. It goes up by the same amount, right? So that's kind of hard to explain with most demand systems that I know in this static Bertrand competition model, right? I think it's possible, but it would require, like, first, a lot of diversion to Bud, and second, I mean, it wasn't easy, right? So what we did is we had a model of competition that nests Bertrand, both before and after, but allows for coordination after the fact between the combined Miller Coors and Budweiser. So the merger does three things. It puts Miller and Coors brands in common ownership. It changes Miller and Coors costs, how much so depending upon how far away they are from how much the distance changes in shipping. Excuse me. And it also allows for this deviation from Bertrand competition ex post. We estimate the extent to which that deviation from Bertrand competition ex post is important. If you take that parameter literally, it has to do with the weight that Miller Coors puts on Bud's profits and vice versa. The way that we identify it is through the inability of the Bertrand model to predict this increase in Bud prices ex post. So that's kind of what's driving it, right? So there's an assumption that Bud's costs aren't going up by a whole lot in this analysis. Okay, so we reject the Bertrand model ex post. We then do a bunch of counterfactual simulations, shutting down this coordination, isolating the different mechanisms through which the merger impacted prices. You can see that it could have been worse if there were no efficiencies. That's the top line. It looks like efficiencies did offset what ended up happening. The raw data, which we're interpreting, is coming from both the coordinated effects, unilateral effects, and these efficiencies is lower, but it didn't do enough. A lot of the price increases driven by coordinated effects, if you shut those down, you actually do pretty well. So it looks like the Bertrand model would have implied that prices were pretty stable both before and after. Okay, so this leads the natural question of, what are they doing, right? If it's not the Bertrand model, is there another model that might better explain what's going on? And in some of the documentary evidence that came up in subsequent antitrust investigations, namely in the investigation into ABI's attempted purchase of Grupo Modelo, a bunch of documents came up that describe behavior that makes it seem as if there's kind of like a leader-follower pricing thing going on here, where Budweiser's proposing prices and then Miller Coors is following. They describe, Bud has kind of a business plan where they describe the way that they're going to do this. That makes it really easy to predict and really easy to understand for Miller Coors. And at the same time, of course, you have to read these things with care, but the tenor of the annual reports of these companies changes quite a bit. Move away from describing the environment as being extremely competitive, pre-merger, to, post-merger, we've got robust pricing, sustained price increases, and so on. Okay, so I think this is an example of a way that you might kind of, it moves a little bit away from like the question that you have to answer at the FTC, like given only this information that you could have before the merger, what would happen to prices? That's a super important question. I think the Bertrand models, that's a really useful framework for thinking about those questions. It's an important model. But I think it points towards kind of more provocative questions as to like what other types of competition might explain the way that things are working in particular industries. And we were asked for ideas for more work. All of these models have lots of kind of parameters that you have to condition on that might be hard to model with only pre-merger information. Marginal costs are one thing. In the models with negotiations that come up in the hospital literature, for example, there's another layer of complexity, these bargaining weights. You have to take a stance on how they might change before and after the merger. Maybe, combined hospitals better able to negotiate with an insurer than they could when they were independently. That might happen through these bargaining weights. So I think these are lots of things that you could explore with more ex post data, and I'm happy to talk more about them later on. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Angelique Mina. I'm an attorney in the Bureau of Competition at the Federal Trade Commission. I should start out by saying that I'm here in my individual capacity, and the views that I am expressing do not reflect those of the Commission or any particular commissioner. I also want to give a big thank you to everyone who helped work on the remedy study. And I want to acknowledge the folks in the audience who helped work on the remedy study as well. In the Federal Trade Commission and staffs in the Bureau of Competition and Economics spent 2+ years working on the merger remedy study that ultimately culminated in a report issued in 2017. Okay, why study merger remedies? The efficacy of our remedies is critical to the Commission's antitrust mission. It enables the Commission to clear what it otherwise would consider to be an anti-competitive deal by requiring the merging parties to divest certain assets and/or take other action that the Commission deems to be able to remediate the harm from the loss of competition it sees from the combination. In 1999, the Commission issued its first divestiture study. There was a lot of learning from that study, and as a result of what was learned in 1999, the Commission took certain reforms, such as the study revealed that when the scope of the asset package is less than an ongoing business, what we call a selected asset package, the remedies tend to prove riskier and don't succeed as often. So in response to that, the Commission started requiring buyers be named up front. Also, because of the 1999 study, the Commission started appointing monitors more frequently, especially in those remedies that proved to be complex or where the products were particularly technical. So the purpose of the more recent merger remedy study was to evaluate the reforms that the Commission took in response to what it learned in the 1999 study, and also to evaluate our merger remedies more comprehensively. Okay, so the goals of our merger remedy study was, one, to assess competition, whether or not the remedy served to maintain or restore competition, and also to evaluate issues that arose during the process to help improve our remedies going forward. Notably, the merger remedy study did not consider whether or not the Commission should have taken the enforcement action in the first place. So the merger remedy study looked at the orders the Commission issued between 2006 and 2012. The Commission issued the 89 merger orders in that time period, and we evaluated those orders in 3 different ways. The way that what I'm going to talk about today is the 50 orders that were evaluated using the case study methodology. And for those 50 orders, those included primarily horizontal mergers, but also a few vertical remedies, and also vertical mergers and remedies, and were primarily of proposed deals, but also included some consummated deals. We evaluated the orders separately by market. There were 184 relevant markets in those orders, and we also evaluated the outcomes of those remedies by buyers, and we had 46 different buyers that served to remediate the harm we saw from the mergers. Our study was a qualitative retrospective. Most of the information that we got was through interviews. We also gathered some limited sales data to help us primarily corroborate what we were hearing in the interviews. We had the benefit of internal information such as commission recommendation memorandums, and we also were able to and did have discussions with the investigative case team to learn more about their case. We conducted a number of interviews, over 200, and we interviewed the respondents, who would be the merging parties in this case, and also the parties that are subject to the commission order. We also interviewed the buyer of divested assets, and for each market, we interviewed 2 competitors, 2 customers, and if the commission appointed a monitor in that order, then we also interviewed the monitors. We had a very high participation rate for our interviews. We also sought out sales data in revenue and volume from key market competitors, and we obtained that sales data through our 6B authority. We evaluated our remedies in 2 different ways. The first way was to consider the competition question, whether or not the remedy maintained or restored competition. The other way was to consider whether or not there were any process concerns that came up during the settlement process as the assets transferred or post-acquisition to see if the buyer had any issues. And our concerns that we asked about and that we heard about in the interviews related primarily to the scope of the divestiture package, the funding commitments by the buyer, whether or not the buyer had adequate due diligence, how the transfer of back office functions went, the length of the transition services and supply agreements, and if it was the case that the order allowed for the divestiture to take place post-merger. We also evaluated how the hold separate business unit went and was implemented. We rated our remedies as a success, a qualified success, or a failure. We also considered whether or not the process concerns rose to such a level that those concerns could have impacted or did impact the success of the remedy. Here you'll see the types of mergers that were included in the case study that we did, as well as the types of remedies that the commission took that we considered in our study. Here you'll see the types of characteristics that our orders had that were in the case study. As you can see, in terms of buyer timing, there were over a majority of our buyers were buyers up front. We also accepted post-order buyers. For package type, over a majority of our packages divestiture packages were of selected assets, although we did have 40% being an ongoing business. The fact that both upfront buyers and selected assets, those numbers go together, is not a coincidence, because as I mentioned before, after the 1999 study, the commission began to require an upfront buyer and selected asset packages to help mitigate the risks that it saw with the parties divesting less than an ongoing business. Overall, our findings were that our remedies are mainly successful, and I encourage you all to read the remedy study because we lay out how we evaluated the outcomes and what our findings were depending on the type of remedy and whatnot. So the scope of the asset package matters. As you can see here, all of our divestitures of an ongoing business were successful. Our divestitures that were of selected assets were less so. This was what we learned in 1999, and it was confirmed in our most recent remedy study. It's not to say that some buyers of selected assets were successful, and those buyers tended to be knowledgeable about the markets, have similar operations or complementary products. Particularly, they might have a product portfolio such that when they acquired the products, the acquired products fit nicely within their portfolio, or they were familiar with the customers. Several of our buyers of selected assets were successful but encountered difficulties. And then 10 of the buyers that failed all acquired selected assets. They all failed for different reasons, but they had all acquired less than an ongoing business. And notably, all of those buyers were also upfront buyers, which indicates that even though we try and mitigate the risk of divesting less than an ongoing business, doing so does not alleviate that risk. So key takeaways, ongoing businesses are less risky in terms of a divestiture package. Upfront buyers will not always eliminate the risk associated with a selected asset package. And really the goal of our remedies when it comes to a divestiture is to set up our buyers as a competitor in the market to replace the competition that we think would be lost by the combination. And that puts our buyer in a position where one day they're negotiating a sales contract with the sellers, who are also our respondents, who are also the merging parties. But our intent is that the buyer will take those assets and the next day be in competition with the sellers. So our divestiture buyers are in a position where they're buying the assets from a competitor, and in many cases, they're also getting transition services from their competitors. And when you think about the dynamics of that, and you're in that mindset, then the other takeaways that we learned from the study really flow naturally. Our buyers do not always have adequate due diligence. We found that they did not always have access to the employees or the facilities or the information that they needed, and they did not have adequate time either. The transfer of back office support functions can be difficult, and this we're talking about IT infrastructure, human resources information, accounting information, and other corporate functions that the assets need to be supported so that they can operate in the markets. And then we also learned during the study that buyers remain reluctant to bring issues to staff and the monitors as they occur. As we were speaking to buyers about their experiences, they raised issues that they had not raised during the settlement process or during the asset purchase and the integration, which led us to understand that despite our efforts in 1999 to encourage communication with buyers as they acquire the assets, they're still overcoming obstacles without having the benefit of our input. We'd like to think that if they came to us earlier, that we would be able to help resolve issues before they materialize into real problems. So to sum up, I think the case study methodology was a really good way for us to look back at our remedies and understand what was working, what's not working, and what we can be doing better going forward.
Okay, we've seen two very different styles of retrospective studies, and I did that on purpose because I think they show how these different approaches can be complementary. Chris, Frank, and Matt did work that is very familiar to economists and the way we think about our tools. We're using data, we're using specific models to make explicit predictions, and we're trying to evaluate how they work. And that's one methodological tool that's used in horizontal merger enforcement. But as somebody who's spent his career working at an antitrust agency, the quantitative component that an economist works on is just one piece of the analysis that takes place. And there's a lot of other work that really doesn't naturally lend itself to quantitative analysis that's really important. And I think the remedy study is a really good example of that. We have an implicit production function that we use to try and solve competition problems by developing this methodology for selling assets, but the only way we can figure out if it works is if we go back periodically and evaluate it. And we do that using a lot of qualitative information. As Angelique was describing, a lot of it is just talking to people. And so because a big part of the purpose of the hearing today is to get advice from people on how the FTC can improve its studies going forward, I wanted to start off with trying to think about how we could use qualitative information more to improve our studies, particularly the studies that I think appeal more to economists trying to do something quantitative. And to start that conversation off, I was going to ask Angelique, could you describe some of the features that the FTC has or access of data that makes it easy for us or makes us more well-positioned to do these kinds of studies?
I think that for the remedy study, we had a large head start because we were able to have access to all the commission recommendation memos, which is a way in which the staffs at the Bureau of Competition Economics recommend to the commission what action they think should be pursued, and it summarizes the evidence and the consent in our case, and also why we think the consent would solve the problem that we see. So we had access to that. We also had access to staff, and they were a tremendous help at helping us understand what the main issues were with investigation and with the settlement. So being able to talk to folks and find out what happened on a one-on-one basis is really helpful. And then we had 6B authority, so we could ask for sales data or basically answers to questions in a written form from the public.
Could you, because I think a lot of people who work at the FTC don't really understand our 6B authority, and people outside definitely don't. Can you describe like what that is and what we can do with 6B authority as a commission? So 6B, the term 6B comes from the Section 6B of the FTC Act, and it empowers the commission to ask for answers in writing from companies or whatnot. It is subject to the Paperwork Reduction Act, which also our study overall was, and as would be the interviews that we conducted, which means that we had to get OMB approval before issuing the 6Bs. The commission issues the 6Bs. They're called an order to file special report, and they are issued pursuant to compulsory process. So with a 6B, for example, the FTC could compel firms to provide data and documentary information?
The rule itself calls for written answers to questions. So,
okay.
You know.
Okay, so with that background, what I wanted to ask the economists would be to think about the studies you've done and the studies you'd like to do in the future. How would this, what other types of information would you like, and how would you use that in your studies? You know, if you could have access to the information the FTC has, or potentially work on a study that used 6B authority. You want to go in order?
Sure, I can chime in. You know, going back to the qualitative question about qualitative information, and back to what Limor was talking about this morning, the cross-market mergers. That's one area where there's research showing that there's an effect, but there's not as much about why that effect exists. Is it related to competition, or is it something that's unrelated to competition? I think being able to talk to the customers after the fact would be really useful to get an explanation of why did you talk to the payers, why did you agree to this price increase? Talk to the employer customers of the health insurers. Why did you see this? I think that would be useful for decomposing those explanations.
Yeah, I would also ask questions like after you've estimated a simulation model to see where things are different. So to focus on basically trying to understand why it's different. So for example, if the markups predicted by your model are different or are maybe seem too low, maybe to get cost information so that you can build that into the model. I mean, then that's still, it's detailed information, quantitative, but also other information, qualitative, could be like asking internal documents from the companies, all assuming that this is feasible, but where maybe they have basically marketing presentations on where they have developed their strategy on pricing and these type of things. And then another thing is maybe about efficiencies. If they have made efficiency claims, I think it would be nice to get internal documents on also whether these were realized.
Matt?
Yeah, I'd follow up on that. I agree with everything that Frank and Chris said. One thing that oftentimes I've seen people might have at the agencies that you rarely have as an academic is cost data. And, of course, that has to be interpreted with care. The type of costs that we really would like to know about for our models might differ from what an accountant would put together for costs. So it has to be looked at carefully. But if you had it in a way, these models that we were talking about are over-identified, right? Because you need to know the model of competition, and if you know that, you assume that, and you know what demand is, and you have a prediction of what costs could be, you could confront that with direct measures to get a sense of how well your model is fitting the data. I think Aviv's old econometrica paper on the cereal industry is a really nice example of how that worked for assessing different models of competition. So that would be very useful. More broadly, kind of any predictions that were made about why the transaction would be competitively benign would be nice to see if they were borne out. So in the beer case, there was a specific prediction that the shipping efficiencies were going to be important. And so that leads to a natural test. You can ask, all else equal, does it look like places where there was greater scope to reduce these shipping distances, do prices go up by less in those markets than they do in markets where there was less scope for that, right? So any kind of specific predictions that were made, that's something that the agencies have that we don't have as academics oftentimes.
So a follow-up to that, I think Chris touched on this a bit, is are there specific industries or questions that you think the value added would be highest? So Chris was just describing this cross-market merger area in the hospital industry might be one where this would be worth doing. Are there other kind of open questions where having this additional data would be particularly high value added?
I could start, but I also don't know what's very important in the US. So, but my thought would be to look at at mergers where you see exposed that maybe you have some anecdotal evidence where there were big price increases. So that would be kind of a general obvious thing. And then maybe also you expect certain merger waves to come so that when you look at it, say, in Europe, for example, at the moment, for example, mobile telecom, there's a merger wave. So I think, because there's different countries and they all, so it's different from here where, but then it would be very interesting to look at further evidence to see what we can learn from future mergers in a similar context.
Yeah, and given the importance for hospital work and the FTC's caseload, I think it'd be great to see more of these models fit to those industries to look to see what happens in the aftermath. I think that's a natural area to look at. Together with this cost information, you might be able to get at how some of these other parameters might have to change in order to explain the way prices and quantities move in the data before and after. I think that'd be really interesting.
So I shift gears a little bit, and these questions are mainly going to be focused towards the economist. One of the big potential value added of the work you've done is to really test to see how well these merger simulation tools work. And so I realize it's a fairly thin record out there. There are not a lot of studies that have done this work. But what would your assessment be of how well the tools are working and where the areas you think people should be focusing more to do more R&D on these kind of techniques? We could shift. I'll start with you, Frank, this time.
Okay. I think the supply side is probably the most important and interesting one. Also, academically, it's been on the table a long time, but I think it's been neglected a bit the last years. So now there's recent interest again in trying to understand conduct better. But of course, it's also the hardest part. I mean, yeah, your paper, Matt, is really interesting on showing this, on how conduct can matter. But generally, it's very challenging because, yeah, there's so many possibilities in a repeated game context. But that's why we need also more evidence on this.
Yeah, just to echo a sentiment that was raised in the previous session, there are only a handful of studies by a handful of people doing this stuff. And I think the more people doing it, the more cases people look at, the better it's going to be, the more you'll learn from it. So I think first I would say, let's not be too hasty to draw general conclusions from like a handful of case studies, but thinking about sensitivity of the models to different specifications, thinking about whether functional forms that might be more flexible or becoming better understood and might help be more robust. I think that's interesting. And I also agree, thinking more about the supply side and how competition might change in ways other than Bertrand to Bertrand is super important.
I think in the healthcare area, one area that needs to be studied more, outpatient facilities. There's very little out there on what would happen with a merger of overlapping outpatient facilities. I think also, and this is sort of a plug for the work that's being done researching COPAs, what happens in mergers when there's regulation, particularly price regulation, as we just saw with the Beth Israel Leahy merger, where the state of Massachusetts put on conditions related to prices. What effects will that have on prices, but also other aspects, quality, access to care? So I think those things need to be studied.
A follow-up on that, thinking about the supply side, how important is that for the use of merger simulation tools as a screen? So like if a merger is combining two firms that sell important substitutes, we're probably going to have a merger simulation predict that merger is going to be problematic. Does it matter that the merger might also increase coordination or not? You want to start?
Yeah, we speak directly to that in the paper with Nate that I talked about briefly in my presentation. If you shut down this parameter that we think describes how firms might be coordinating, it's one way to do it anyway, and just focus on the other two mechanisms through which the merger changed pricing incentives, the unilateral effects and the efficiencies, then prices didn't really go up. So in that context, it looked like it could be important. It's just one case.
Either.
Yeah, I'm adding, of course, yeah, I think it's important. I think it's fine to start using Bertrand models, but it's more when we see that there's deviations in ex post studies that we want to try to understand this. But, to make conclusions, suppose that we find 10 cases where there's always been coordinated effects, that might tell us something, but I think even without this, I think most of the mergers that would include coordinated effects would probably, in the painkiller merger, for example, that I studied, we allowed for coordination in a bit different way, because we allowed coordination already before the merger. But if we would not have allowed for this, we would still have found sizable price effects. They would be different, but in terms of the conclusions, I don't think they would have changed too much.
Chris, do you have anything, or?
Just with healthcare, work done with for example, the Ho and Lee paper published a few months ago, and you could certainly use that as Frank and Matt have done, comparing the counterfactual of mergers to see how well the Nash and Nash works. So I think that's useful. It's very data intensive, though. They had insurer counterfactuals there, and they were able to get very good data. We see now there are few states that have all-payer claims databases, which you really need to do this work in healthcare. Places like HCCI, Humana, and United are withdrawing now, and that may limit the use of that going forward. I think we need more of that detailed data to do this work. For coordination, at least for healthcare, I would want to know what they're coordinating on at the first step, because contracts for hospitals, for instance, are so complex.
So, again, realizing that it's a thin record, what does the thin record tell economists working at the antitrust agencies they should do as a set of best practices when using these empirical tools for merger screening type purposes?
Well, if I can jump in, I think it's already reflected a little bit with the horizontal merger guidelines. So the 2010 revision explicitly states that for differentiated products, we're moving away from the use of things like HHI and moving more toward things like diversion ratios and the upward pricing pressure. For differentiated products cases, I think that's the right approach. You should move away from things like HHI and move more toward those things. Of course, for the lawyers in the room, you still have to prove a market. That's part of the law. So ways in which that market definition can be consistent with the predictions of the models, I think is what we need to focus on.
Yeah, so I think what would be needed as basically best practices is to do a lot of sensitivity analysis on the things we've discussed, demand side, supply side, and check how the results would change under different assumptions, and then in addition complement that with, because the models that we're using are econometrics, but don't be addicted to these models, and also use outside information to try to see which, when we do the sensitivity analysis, which, I mean, maybe in many cases the results would go in the same direction, but if they don't, then this extra external information can be very useful to incorporate.
Yeah, again, kind of the worst part about going last is...
You should start next time.
I agree with everything Frank said. Like understanding, what parts of your prediction... This is stuff that people here, I think, are probably already doing a lot of, but I think it's important just to acknowledge what parts of your analysis are coming from assumption and what's coming from the ability of your model to fit the data. And if you don't have the ability to fit a flexible model, think about the predictions of alternatives.
Let's see. So we have a question from the audience for Angelique, which was why in the remedy study did the team focus on a 2 to 3 year time period for determining the success of a remedy, and what is kind of the interpretation of focusing on a relatively short time period rather than, a longer time period?
So I think that's referring to the different ratings where we had success. Qualified success is when it took a little bit longer for our buyers or for what we saw post order to get the competition back up to where we expected it to be. And one is we kind of looked back to the merger guidelines where we saw that there's an entry analysis that relies on this 2 year time period. And then as we were going through the process, some buyers seemed to really be able to step into the shoes of the merging parties pretty much immediately or within a short time period. And then some were able to do so, but it just took them longer than we had anticipated it would take them to. And so that's where the qualified success with the longer time period came in.
A somewhat related question. So the remedy study was a huge undertaking. I mean, the commission invested a massive amount of resources in this study. What did we do with that information to try to improve our enforcement behavior, to kind of justify the investment?
Oh, sure. So we learned a great deal of information from the study that we began incorporating pretty much immediately in terms of the way that we vet our buyers or the scope of the asset package and press on the pressure points that we see in, when we're crafting remedies. Really asking questions about, is the buyer doing getting the due diligence that it thinks it needs, that it would normally get in an arm's length transaction? Asking the respondents or the proposed respondents what steps they're taking to provide the due diligence that's needed, really pressing on questions about transition services and the kinds of back office support that a buyer might need going forward. I'll go ahead and make this plug now because I was going to do it eventually anyway. Please read the remedy study. It's only 37 pages. But if you don't have time, read the back, because in the back we have a set of best practices. It's like 7 pages long, and it's really intended to let respondents and buyers know what to expect when they're part of this commission order divestiture process. What kinds of information we're looking for. Most informed a great deal from what we heard in the remedy study, and what kind of questions we'll be asking when they come forward with a proposal, and when the buyers come to us and explain to us what their business plan is.
Frank, in your presentation, you talked about other areas where these kinds of studies would be useful. And one of your slides, or one of your comments was on using a merger retrospective in an auction type setting. Can I put you on the spot? And do you have an industry where you think this would be particularly successful?
Okay. So I had little time, so now it's a good moment to talk about it. So I think in auction markets, for example, construction auctions, there's a recent paper by people in Vienna, Christine Zulehner and Googler and other co-authors, who basically look at, there's many bidders there, so it's a market with a lot more competition, but they both do an ex post analysis and also study then an auction market, and basically the estimated structural bidding model for auctions, to try to see how things compare. And so I think it's a promising area. Maybe the unfortunate thing for research, but I think it's a very interesting paper, is that there's relatively many bidders. That's good for the market, of course, but the effects of mergers would be relatively small. On the other hand, auction markets, I think, are also interesting because the rules of the auction are well known. There could still be deviations if there's collusion and stuff like that, but at least it's better known than if you're studying differentiated products market. So I think this could be definitely an interesting avenue if there are a lot of mergers in bidding markets going on, that to study this. Yeah.
So I follow up to that. I know it's not your paper, but when I think of a lot of the bidding markets we see here internally, they often involve products that are very customized. And so, you have 2 customers coming in, they might have some RFP type process, but the service components to the different purchases can be very different. And so there's a serious measurement problem for price, and trying to think of a counterfactual that you'd be using in the merger retrospective piece will be difficult. In a construction type setting, is that less of an issue?
So this is not my main research, but I think just generally in auctions, I agree that prices are customized, but I don't think that's necessarily an issue, because even when prices are different for all customers through the bidding process. The advantage is it gives us lots of data, so we can do sensible econometrics. And we can still make forecasts on what would be the effect of the merger, even though it might not be materialized to an individual customer, but we can still make an expected prediction about it. So we need, of course, lots of covariates that explain or that can try to explain why, say, one auction is different than another, but I don't think there should be an impediment to study this.
We had another question from the audience. I'm not sure, because Angelique and I think would be the ones to answer it, which was, has the FTC studied the effectiveness of firewalls as a remedy to a vertical merger, such as a remedy recently imposed in the Staples Ascendant case? I'm not aware of that.
Well, so in the merger remedy study, we had 4 vertical cases, and most, if not all of those cases were information sharing cases where the remedy was a firewall. So yes, in the study we did follow up to find out how those firewalls were working.
And how did they?
They worked.
They worked, okay.
So we spoke to primarily, the most informative part of that was speaking to the monitors who really were, the monitors oversee compliance with the order and help facilitate when there's a problem involved, if there's a buyer, but in vertical cases, there wasn't a buyer with the firewall cases. But so we had very detailed discussions with the monitors.
So I should probably take a step back. What's a firewall?
So a firewall is essentially when you try and cabin off competitively competitively sensitive information so that individuals in one part of the company do not have access to what we do not want shared with the other part of the company. And it can be done, through IT systems. It can be done very easily because you can just not enable people to have access to that information over IT servers or whatnot. But you also train people, and you also do follow-ups to make sure that people are in compliance with the ground rules that are set up, so that there is no sharing of information that shouldn't be.
I think we've covered this a bit, but I think I'll go back to it, because one of the common criticisms I've heard of merger retrospectives over the last 20 years is the case study critique, that that you put a lot of work in, you learn a lot about something, but who cares, because it might not tell us anything about the next transaction, the next deal, whatever. So for this area where we're looking at the statistical tests of merger tools, how worried are you about the case study critiques of this very small sample of studies which have looked at these tools? And the summary of the tool seems to be there's a lot of value. These things can pick up, we can pick up demand substitution, we can identify substitutes, and we can make predictions, but the predictions are kind of noisy and sensitive to assumptions that are hard to evaluate using only pre-merger data. So
yeah, that's a hard question. So of course there are limits to how you can extrapolate from one of these studies to another. Just the way that a lot of this work, especially some of the work that I talked about, is built, is the details really matter a lot, right? Like who competes with who, how the demand system looks, what the different firms' marginal costs are, how those change. That's not going to be easy to extrapolate from one industry to another, of course. On the other hand, my kind of hope is that you might learn something through this process about how competition works in particular industries, and that's where I think focusing more on the supply side and conduct is really important. Hopefully it's somewhat stable and you can build off it. If everything's always in flux, you're kind of hosed, right?
go, Frank?
Yeah, if I agree with that. So if I can add to that, so if we would be interested to know what is kind of the average price effect of a merger, then I would agree fully with you. Then, I mean, yeah, single or even 10 case studies might not be enough. We would need 100. But if it's the purpose, what we're talking about here in this session is about evaluating tools like structural models of supply and demand, it remains case study, so we also need a lot. But I mean, we can still learn from how these models perform, and maybe already 10 studies would be very informative. I think all the studies that are there now already tell us quite a lot on what they're doing well and where they can do better. So if it's the purpose of just evaluating the methods, then I think the case study issue, I mean, it is valid, but so you need more research, of course, but it's not a big issue that one is looking at one sector or one industry.
Yeah, I think it kind of shows the trade-off between the detail you can have with a study and this, the sample size issue. Like the Mergers Retrospectives project, that was 4 mergers. studied in detail. Doing a fully specified merger simulation is very data intensive. So like what I did, you can get the sample sizes up to 28, but the cost of that is I was only able to do reduced form merger simulations and the basic screens. So there is that trade-off. It's very resource intensive to look at methods that are, I think, would be better, like a fully specified merger simulation, to really evaluate those well.
I guess, Angelique, the same question to you. What do you think about the generalizability of the findings, from the remedy study? I mean, that's explicitly a case study, but it's pretty close to the population of remedies we did, right? Or a very large fraction.
So it was a very broad, cross-sectional study of 89 orders, hundreds of markets. And the one commonality was that they were subject to commission order. So in learning about the process and concerns that came up about our remedy process, I think it was very informative because that was one commonality where we could ask similar questions across all interviewees. We asked similar questions as it related to competition as well, but they were all, the industries were just so varied that it made it a little more difficult to be able to compare apples to apples.
But if you're kind of, and if we get to something that we're not allowed to talk about because it's confidential, just don't. But the way you describe the findings is the general findings didn't seem to be terribly industry specific. It was much more related to the structure of the remedy or characteristics of the remedy. And so, is that true? Like it's not the case that in this widget industry we always have problems.
Right. We didn't look at specific industries to see if there were particular problems within a particular industry. It would have been really difficult to do that in the case study because they were all, I mean, the types of products and the industries involved were so varied that it would have been very difficult to do so. But they all went through the settlement process, and we always evaluate the scope of the asset package if it's a divestiture. We always evaluate the buyer. The buyer is acquiring assets and going through that process. So there are similarities that we could ask about that carried over from one case to another.
Another question from the audience. So far, all of the studies have evaluated structural models, and the question is, can these retrospective studies be used to evaluate reduced form approaches to prospective merger analysis, such as what was done in the Staples case?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. I think it's a good idea. Like anytime there's a prediction made that's quantifiable, looking to see if it's borne out after the fact is possible, no matter what the tool. Yeah, I don't mean to beat up on the structural models. I think that's true in general.
Just to elaborate, but I fully agree, but I think the structural models, we're using them because sometimes we have those data on prices and output quantity, so it's the best we can do, and then that's how we can forecast. But in the Staples case or in airline mergers, we have unique other experiments to look at, so it's like the same company that's active across markets. So if one has this data, then it's so rich, one has to use it, but then of course we need to evaluate it too.
The one plug I'll do for my own research is a number of co-authors at the FTC did a bunch of work looking at mergers in the supermarket industry, and we also looked at entry and exit in the supermarket industry. And our editor on the entry-exit paper wanted us to compare how the exit and entry effects, how entry affects price, how exit affects price, compared to what we found from mergers. And so it's not exactly this, but it's close. And we found that exit was a terrible predictor of prices, but that entry, the price effects of entry, seem similar to what you would get in a merger retrospective. So another question, is there a difference in technique or approach in doing a merger retrospective of the type being discussed and the investigation of a consummated merger?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. I think what this question might be getting at is, that in the FTC can and has challenged consummated mergers, and when we do that, there's a certain production process called a law enforcement investigation, where we would try and determine if that merger was anti-competitive or not. And how does that compare to the kind of work you've done evaluating?
Well, I can speak to, for instance, Evanston. That was the case with where we did a merger retrospective, and you can do the standard diff and diff approach, but then there is the question of what did the merger cause the price increase? Well, in a court case, you can actually look at the documents, look at the negotiations that are going on, and connect the qualitative information and evidence with the quantitative, and that was what was done in that case, where it was very clear that the price increases were caused by the merger and not just coincident with it.
Looks like we might have time for one more question. I've probably asked this a number of times, but I'll ask it one more time. So, how do we think of the value added of these merger simulation tools compared to traditional screens for merger analysis? So, I'll speak for myself. I started working here approximately 1 million years ago, and at that time, quantitative analysis meant calculating HHIs 16 different ways. That was your robustness check. And so how would we say we've progressed with these tools? And do we think they're better than HHIs?
As I said before, I think in the hospital case, and I think this is probably true in general with differentiated products cases, I think the tools that are based on models of price formation, whether it's Bertrand or whether it's Nash and Nash in the hospital's case, are more accurate. And I think my paper and others have shown that. So I think when it's feasible to do that, that should be used for prospective analysis. Again, you may have to do the standard merger analysis as well, but when you do that, those market definitions that are the basis of the HHI should be consistent with the way your theory of harm and the way the markets are working as you understand it. So I do think they're an improvement in that context.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a much more nuanced view of who competes with who than yes or no in the market or not. And also, in principle, it gives you a framework for thinking about, kind of sidesteps the issue of like what you take a share of, right? A share of what, right? You got to define the market. So, in principle, a well-specified demand system could give you a lot of the information that you would need to get a more direct answer.
Frank?
I agree. So just to add, so I think whenever when you have differentiated products markets, but more specifically when there's an asymmetric kind of differentiation so that you have niche products, like in the painkiller was one example, but it applies to almost every market. If the merging firms are competing in one segment or something, then a symmetric measure like HHI would not be sufficient. Also, it allows you, like you mentioned, with HHI, you can do lots of robustness. So it's hard for me to imagine exactly what that means, while if you do robustness in a structural model, you can feed in prior information that you have and then see how the results are robust towards an assumption of higher marginal cost or something. Then maybe one remark on what's nice about HHI is that it's very clear, although I forgot now exactly what it is in US, but you have the thresholds like 2,500 or stuff like that. While it's not clear to me, neither in Europe, but I think also in US, what is the threshold for a price increase to be problematic. I'm not sure what's the answer to that, but it's something also we need to think about. What's the threshold?
Well, I think that's a natural point to take a break for lunch. For those who are, well, I guess for everybody, we have a cafeteria upstairs on the 7th floor. We have a relatively short time until we start again in about an hour. So thanks a lot.